Let me take you back a little bit. We live at a time of moral ambiguity, when it is hard to tell right from wrong. Our confidence in Western liberal democracy has been shaken, and we are uncertain about its future. In such times, it's good to look back at previous times this has happened, and see how they dealt with it and got out of it. Today, we are going back to the 1930s and 40s, the time of the Great Depression, the rise of totalitarianism and the World War, to take a long journey through the shadowy parts of that period. At a time when light and dark blended, two cool cats walked among the shadows with more dignity than anyone else, and helped lead us back into the light. They are also two personal heroes of mine, and it is time I paid them tribute.
It's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die.
This video is part of a series which I call Existentialism in the Pop Age. We are in the Pop Age, as I define it, and existentialism is no longer relevant. Why? Because in the Pop Age, we already take the existentialist insights, at least the smart ones, as self-evident. However, when you consider something self-evident, you forget the deep spiritual meaning that it carries. If you are unaware of the struggles that led to the formation of your values, your spirit is made shallow. It is therefore important to remind ourselves how we got here, and what the existentialists can still teach us about life. We shall relive a time when the Pop Age was at its infancy and existentialism was at its height, and discuss two figures whose career paralleled each other, and who embodied the existentialist hero. Representing the European, existentialist side is Albert Camus, a French novelist, playwright and philosopher. Since his name is funny to say in English, I shall pronounce it Camus. Representing the American, pop side is Humphrey Bogart, the Hollywood legend. We are going to go through their lives and all their major works, and I will do my best not to spoil too much. So buckle in, and let them take us through the darkness and into the light. Those who are familiar with my work know that I divide the Pop Age into three periods. I usually focus on the later periods, but today we are going to be focusing on the first period, what I call the Hollywood period. This period is also the transitional phase between the Pop Age and the age that preceded it, the Modern Age. In this period, the modern logic decayed while the pop logic gradually took shape, and in this video, through our two heroes, we are going to outline this paradigm shift. The Modern Age was driven by a rebellion against the idea that there is a paradise in the afterlife, and that our earthly life should be dedicated to achieve this paradise. Instead, believed the moderns, we should use our human faculties to turn our world into a paradise. However, man is not ready yet to create this heaven on earth. Man must mature until he becomes wholly enlightened and capable of devising the perfect human society. This maturation, achieved through historical progress, was the main idea that shaped the entire modern age. When we say man, it should be understood in two ways. First, there's the individual, who should grow and mature. But there is also the universal man, the whole of humanity. According to the modern paradigm, every one of us is a unique individual, but also has attributes that are shared by all humans. Thus, everyone is part of this universal man. Mainly, the belief was that reason was something that we all universally share. But our minds are currently awash with superstitions and therefore we think unreasonably, causing us to be divided. By personally maturing, an individual can also present new ideas, which help the progress of the universal man. The more the universal man progresses, the more each of us becomes more enlightened. Eventually, this progress through history would lead to a universal utopian society, governed by reason, in which every individual will be free to fully actualize themselves and achieve happiness. This progress is achieved on two levels. First, there's the material level, the advancement of science and technology, with which man can master nature and create the grounds for utopia. Secondly, there's the ideological level. With every new idea, man learns more about himself, about human nature. Eventually, he will fully know himself, and will be able to devise society accordingly. The ones who represent this level most of all were the authors, who wrote books that delved into the human psyche. Every new novel or philosophical work was seen as taking us a step forward, and the authors were regarded as heroes who should be studied and followed. Thus, with great hopes, the modern age set forth to bring heaven on earth. I divide the modern age into several periods. In the early periods, the belief was that humanity has been progressing since the dawn of civilization, and we are merely the last step before it achieves full maturation. The modern state and the ideals of enlightenment were seen as taking us to our final destination if we just stay on the path. But in the middle of the 19th century, many youngsters grew impatient of waiting. What I call the modernist period, lasting from the mid-1860s to the mid-1920s, is typified by the collapse of the belief that the current trajectory would lead to utopia. The belief now is that our traditional beliefs are a hindrance on our way to a perfect society. Man must employ his intelligence to figure out the truth that is hidden by these traditions, set it free, and build a society upon that. Thinkers were now trying to dig beneath the surface of our thought to unearth that hidden truth. In art, this period sees a rebellion against all traditional concepts of beauty. In politics, the aim is to liberate the truth that is hidden under the surface of society and reshape society based on it. The right-wing version believes that this truth is the national spirit that has been corrupted by foreign influences. The left-wing version believes that this truth is the communist utopia that is being denied of us by the current power structures. Only a revolution that will overthrow the current rotten order and impose an order based on that truth will bring utopia. This period also sees a flurry of new inventions that radically transform human life, like the light bulb, recording technology, the telephone, the automobile, and the airplane. The mid-1910s are when the pop age begins, with the Hollywood period. In this period, American pop culture begins to create an alternative logic to the modern logic. By this point, modern advancement already gave humans plenty of leisure time, and a plethora of enjoyments to fill this time with. American pop does not care about a future utopia, but focuses on utilizing modern progress to make the most out of the present. In Europe, meanwhile, most were still stuck in the modernist logic, which was now devolving and decaying. Why? Because it took place against the backdrop of the collapse of modern logic as a whole. As we recall, we said that in the modern logic there was tension between the individual and the collective. Every individual felt pressure to develop their unique self, but also to help advance the universal man. The resolution was supposed to come at the end of history, when universal man completes his growth, resulting in utopia that will make every individual free. But in the Hollywood period, this cohesion fell apart. The individual and the collective were now seen as opposed to each other. Those who chose the collective espoused a totalitarian state, which erased the individual altogether and tried to impose the perfect society by force, whereas those who espoused individualism regarded the individual as an island detached from human society. Existentialism was the logical outcome of this individualism. To say it differently, while America was in the Hollywood period, Europe was still stuck in the modernist period. But I call it the late modernist period, when modern logic decayed. In this video, Humphrey Bogart shall represent the American pop side, while Albert Camus will represent the European modernist side. As our American representative was born first, we shall start with him. Humphrey DeForest Bogart was born in New York City on the Christmas Day of 1899, on the cusp of the American century. He came from an upper-class family. His father's father became rich from lithography, and his father, Belmont Bogart, was a successful surgeon. His mother, Maud Humphrey, was a commercially successful painter and illustrator. It was a politically mixed couple. Belmont was a 19th century conservative, whereas Maud was a feminist. The firstborn, as his name suggests, was a combination of the two. On the one hand, he displayed the dignity, discipline, and self-reliance of a conservative. On the other, he was an iconoclast and held strong liberal views. It's a combination that he would bring to perfection. Young Humphrey goes to the best schools, getting the best education. but he is a rebellious and pugnacious kid who refuses to play by the rules and belong to any frame. In 1918, as he drops out of yet another Ivy League high school, he becomes eligible for the World War that the US had recently joined. His parents want to arrange a safe stateside service, but Humphrey wants adventure and enlists in the US Navy. The war ends before he gets to see any action, but his time in service does leave two lasting legacies. One is his love for sailing, and the other is a scar on his upper lip. Years later, the Hollywood PR men will aggrandize the scar as a wartime injury, to bolster his tough guy image. It was probably just the result of a brawl with another soldier. World War I was also significant for the future of our other hero. Albert Camus was born in November 1913, just before the war. Albert's starting point couldn't have been further than Humphrey's. He was born in Mondovi, a small town in Algeria, then colonized by France. His grandparents were among the first Frenchmen to settle the North African country, and his father was a winemaker. The Frenchmen who lived in Algeria were usually poor, and denigrated by those who lived in France, and Albert's family was no exception. To make things much worse, his father died in service in the first months of the war, leaving the newborn with not many prospects for the future. His family eventually moved to the capital Algiers, where he grew up. Unlike Bogart, young Camus knows that he needs to work hard to get to anything, and is a good student who develops a keen interest in philosophy and literature. Bogart doesn't seem to have many future prospects either after the war, being a high school dropout without any idea what he wants to do in life. In 1920 he starts to work in theater, first behind the scenes, but by 21 he becomes an actor. With no training or any prior experience, he has to learn the craft as he goes along, and by 1924 he is already playing leading roles. These were the roaring 20s, when things were changing in a big way. The culture is taken over by common folk, who now have access to means that previously belonged only to high society. The new mediums of cinema and recorded music allow them to express themselves, and become trendsetters. Thus, ways of expression that were considered vulgar by the high class now become part of the public sphere. Women, who traditionally stayed at home, are now going out to party in clubs and speakeasies, and are a lot more sexually daring. The gender roles are challenged, and gender identities are subverted. Bogart is part of this new spirit, but because of his upbringing, he comes over as a classier, more old-fashioned male. He brings this quality to his acting as well, and finds moderate success. After the 1929 stock market crash, the party was over. Broadway was hit hard, and there was hardly any work. In 1930, Bogart decides to try his luck out west, in Hollywood. In the next couple of years, he plays secondary roles in about a dozen movies. But he leaves no particular impression, and eventually returns to New York. In Algeria, the year 1930 marked the centennial of French colonization. The French celebrate and congratulate themselves for bringing civilization to other places in the world, and elevating the natives there. In the modern mindset, progress was above all, and Europeans believed they had a duty to bring it to the rest of the world. The local Arabs don't really take part in the celebrations, but no one cares about their opinion. For the teenaged Camus, this is a bad year, as he comes down with a bad case of tuberculosis. The doctors manage to save his life, but his lungs are permanently damaged, and he will live the rest of his life feeling that death is imminent. The 1930s were a tumultuous time in Europe, and Algeria felt the political turmoil. The feeling was that capitalist liberal democracy failed, that another approach is needed to achieve the perfect society. Fascism was ascendant, took over Germany and was scoring victories in Spain and Ethiopia. Camus, like many other youngsters, believes that fascism is the end product of capitalism, the manifestation of its failure. In 1935, he joins the Communist Party, even though he is not enamored by Marxism and considers it to be spiritually hollow. But he does see communism as the only way to defeat fascism and establish a more just society. In 1936, he forms an independent theater company and starts to direct and act in plays. The plays that he chooses to stage are those that have a social message, dramatizing the struggles of the poor and downtrodden to achieve a more equal and just world. This communist phase doesn't last long. Camille wants to create great theater, great art, and realizes that subordinating his art to Marxist dogma is stifling his expression. Moreover, he is awakened to the hypocrisy of the movement. As the native Arabs protest against colonial rule and demand Algerian independence, the communists do not take their side. They do not believe in national struggles, asserting that colonialism should be overthrown only through a class struggle. Camille believes that the party should stand on the side of the oppressed in any struggle, and makes his opinions known. This, of course, cannot be tolerated in the Communist Party, in which any divergence from the party line is considered a sign of degeneracy. Since Camille is quite a celebrity within the Algerian branch, already known locally as a writer, director, and actor, they choose to make an example of him. By the middle of 1937, he is purged from the party. Now unaffiliated, Camille continues his activities and starts writing for a new newspaper. Significantly, unlike many other publications of the time, Alger Républicain does not take an ideological line. Instead, it fights against particular injustices wherever it finds them, in the capitalist system, in the justice system, in the colonialist administration, in the fascist ideology, and in the antisemitism that was at its worst in Nazi Germany, but also rife in Algeria and everywhere else. As a leading columnist, Camille is very much involved in dictating this line. He also continues to direct plays, now focusing on the art, not the social message. He enjoys American cinema as well, but regards it as mere entertainment. The theater is superior in his eyes, as it can also be an art form. To understand the difference between theater and cinema, and why the former was regarded more highly than the latter, we needn't go any further than look at what Bogart was doing at that time. In 1935, he plays a major role in the play The Petrified Forest, and a year later he reprises the role in a film adaptation. The backdrop for the play is the Great Depression and the disenchantment with capitalism. Between the years 32 to 34, criminals like Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, and Pretty Boy Floyd committed a series of bank robberies across several states and became cultural heroes for sticking it to the system. The authorities saw them as a menace, and it led to the formation of the FBI, which managed to kill all of them in 1934. Bogart's character is Duke Mantee, a dangerous outlaw who leads a gang of robbers and killers on the run from the authorities. It was a hit on Broadway, but not typical of 30s Hollywood, which focused on providing escapist fantasies. Most of Hollywood, anyway. There was one studio that was different. Warner Brothers saw itself as a studio that focuses on working-class people, and gathered a roster of actors who could play those parts. Warner Brothers bought the rights to the film adaptation, and Bogart could finally show what he could do on the big screen. The film looks very much like a theater play, taking place almost entirely in one place, a service station in the middle of nowhere, in the Arizona desert. Leslie Howard plays a vagabond who wanders into the place, and we learn that he is a failed writer who is touring the world, looking for something to believe in. He meets a lovely young Betty Davis, who is dreaming of going somewhere else. The top aspiration for American girls of the time was Hollywood, but she wants to go to France. Howard realizes that she is a talented painter, and believes she has potential for greatness. When the place is taken over by Duke Mantee and his gang, he finally finds his calling. He changes his will to leave all his fortune to the girl, and asks Mantee to kill him so she can have it and achieve her potential. Petrified Forest is a great showcase for the modern mindset. Every character is a facet of universal humanity, and they are all part of the struggle for progress. The progress is achieved through talented individuals, in this case, the girl painter, but everyone, even the gangster, are helping her to get to the point where she can endow humanity with her uniqueness. This is the story at the basis of many modern theater plays. This is what was regarded as deep at the time, whereas the stories of Hollywood movies were seen as shallow. That is why Betty Davis here prefers France over Hollywood. She has a deep spirit that, in the mindset of the time, can fully actualize itself only in Europe and through modern art.
You're in love with her, aren't you?
Yes, I suppose I am. And not unreasonably. She has heroic stuff in her. She may be one of the immortal women of France. Another Joan of Arc, Georges Sand, Madame Curie, or Du Barry. I want to show her that I believe in her, and how else can I do it? Living, I'm worth nothing to her. Dead, I can buy her the tallest cathedrals, golden vineyards, and dancing in the streets. One well-directed bullet will accomplish all that, and it'll earn a measure of reflected glory for him that fired it and him that stopped it. This document will be my ticket to immortality. It'll inspire people to say of me, there was an artist who died before his time. Will you do it, Duke? I'll be glad to.
The one who steals the show, however, is Humphrey Bogart, who is at once both menacing and sympathetic. After the success of the film, his road to movie stardom seems paved. But for the next few years, Warner Brothers mostly wastes his talents, sticking him in many silly B-movies. Here, for example, is a scene from the 1936 flick Isle of Fury. The man in the diving suit is supposed to be Bogart. This is supposed to be a giant octopus, and we are about to witness what is supposed to be an epic undersea battle. You get the picture. Eventually, it becomes apparent that Bogart can shine in only one genre. The gangster flicks were Warner Brothers' specialty, starting from 1931's Little Caesar, and were home to all the working-class tough guys. The typical heroes of Hollywood gangster flicks were not like Duke Mantee, who was more like a throwback to the outlaws of the Wild West. They were urban gangsters, of the type that rose to fame during Prohibition, and were usually immigrants. The Hays Code, which limited what could be shown in Hollywood movies, restricted the mentioning of the gangster's ethnicity, but you could not restrict the way they looked. The two biggest stars of the genre were the Jewish Edward G. Robinson and the Irish James Cagney, and they looked like foreigners. The code also permitted making violent films only if they had social merit, so the gangster flicks were always morality tales about why crime doesn't pay. They always presented the theory for why the hero turned rotten, and implied a solution. If the screenwriters were right-wing, they would blame it on human nature, and the solutions were religion and strong law enforcement. If they were left-wing, they would blame it on society, suggesting that things could be better if the system was fixed. The gangster films, then, were still abiding by the rules of the modern age. They were dramas which attempted to show us how humanity can progress and overcome its problems. But they did it in a very simplistic manner, which is why they were seen as inferior to theater. However, what the detractors of Hollywood failed to realize was that the creative process in films was not in the stories that they told. It was rather in the making of the stars. Because the Hollywood period realized that there are certain actors who had a certain quality, a quality that is hard to define, but can definitely be felt. It is called glamour. When they were on the big screen, there was something magnetic about them that made them appear larger than life. The studios would look for people who had this quality, and then search for a character that brought it out of them. Once the character was found, they would play it in every film, and the stories were structured to allow them to shine. They became role models, imitated by young people the world over. Cagney and Robinson, in their gangster roles, played sympathetic, tragic heroes who you could identify with until they met their inevitable doom. They were tough, ruthless, charismatic, and cool, and for those who grew in violent neighborhoods, they were models of behavior on the streets. So, while modern theater plays were about perfecting the universal man, Hollywood movies were about perfecting models of individuality within the modern world. Humphrey Bogart played in some of the best gangster flicks of the late 30s, like Angels with Dirty Faces and The Roaring Twenties. However, he was always the unsympathetic villain, an unscrupulous heavy whose tough exterior covered the volcano of negative emotions. He was as tough as Cagney and Robinson, but he always played second fiddle to them. They were stars, he was not. He did not yet discover the character that would allow him to shine. Only in 1941 did he finally get a role befit his unique talents. Before we talk about it, though, we need to talk about existentialism. And for that, we need to reconnect with our other hero. In 1936, Camus travels to Europe, visiting several countries, including Nazi Germany that was rapidly descending into madness. Upon return, he writes a series of short stories, published in 1937 as a collection under the title Betwixt and Between. He tells us how he didn't find himself at home in the northern European countries, how dwelling within advanced human civilization made him feel alienated and lonely. In contrast, the Mediterranean weather and landscapes make him happy. The warm feeling of the sun on his skin makes him aware of his existence in this world, and it is a joyful feeling. But this awareness also makes him face the reality that his happiness is temporary, since he is going to die one day. Death is present in all the stories, and he tries to reconcile his love of life with the idea of death. He finds no resolution. This focus on death was very much in the spirit of the time. In 1927, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger published his seminal book Being and Time, a cornerstone of existentialist philosophy. One of the main questions in the book is how to live an authentic existence. The answer is that there is only one certainty in human existence, and that is the fact that you are going to die. To live an authentic life, then, you must always be aware of the temporality of your existence, and conduct yourself accordingly. And since death is a personal thing, living authentically means living in the knowledge that you are alone. To be with others is to forget yourself, and thus be inauthentic. The modern idea of the universal man, of everyone living happily together, crumbles. It has created what Heidegger calls Das Man, someone who just does as the collective does, and has no authentic personal traits. Modern mass culture has created this ideal of a universal enlightened man, which all of us should conform to. But by conforming to it, we are losing ourselves. We find echoes of this thought in Camus' Betwixt and Between, in which he escapes human society to be alone and to ponder on death. But he also ponders on life, and unlike most existentialists, he is happy in his human existence. This first book is still quite immature, but he gets better fast. In 1938 he publishes Nuptials, a collection of short essays, each dedicated to a Mediterranean city he visits. Here, Camus' poetic talent blossoms, as he describes the beauty of nature. The title comes from an essay called Nuptials in Tipasa, in which he describes a visit to the Algerian town Tipasa and celebrates his marriage to nature at springtime. In the spring, Tipasa is inhabited by gods, and the gods speak in the sun and the scent of absinthe leaves, in the silver armor of the sea, in the raw blue sky, the flower-covered ruins, and the great bubbles of light among the heaps of stone, he rhapsodizes in the opening paragraph. The mention of gods here is metaphorical. Camus feels like he doesn't need any gods, that this world contains everything one needs to be happy. Thus, he also rejects the modern idea of reshaping the world in a perfect way. Tipasa used to be a Roman colony, and the ruins of their civilization, now conquered by flowers and shrubs, remind us that everything man builds is temporary. In another essay, he writes, "Men and societies have succeeded one another in this place. Conquerors have marked this country with their non-commissioned officers' civilization. They had a vulgar and ridiculous idea of greatness, measuring the grandeur of their empire by the surface it covered. The miracle is that the ruin of that civilization is the very negation of that ideal. For the skeleton town, seen from high above as evening closes in and white flights of pigeons circle around the triumphal arch, engrave no signs of conquest or ambition on the sky. The world always conquers history in the end." Camus rejects the idea of historical progress towards happiness in the future. What we should be doing is focus on the present, on finding happiness by submerging with the world around us. Once again, the sun plays a major role in all the stories, its light and warmth making him aware of his joyful existence within the world. But here, the sea plays an equally important role. Even as he dwells within the blossoming nature of Tipasa, Camus writes that, "Even here, I know I shall never get close enough to the world. I must be naked, then dive into the sea, still perfumed with earth's essences, to wash the perfumes in the sea, and to consummate on my flesh the embrace for which earth and sea, lip to lip, have yearned so long. In the water, I feel a sudden chill. I rise up through the cold, cloudy glue, then dive, my ears buzzing, nose running, mouth bitter, and swim. My arms glistening with water, I leave the sea to bronze in the sun, then re-enter with a twist of their muscles. The water flows over my body, my legs tumultuously take possession of the sea, and the horizon disappears. In the sea, he forgets himself, dissolves into nature. But once he gets out and feels the sun again, he returns to his own individuality. Those are two different joyful earthly experiences. One is the experience of feeling the pleasure of being in the world, associated with the sun. The other is the feeling of losing yourself to the world, associated with the sea. As someone who lives in a Mediterranean country, I can very much relate to these metaphors. So life is joyful, and you must live in the now, not waste it on working towards some other existence in the future or in the afterlife. Yet here, too, death is always a presence, the tragic realization that one day he will have to depart from this world that he loves. This realization drives him to live an authentic life, one that is always aware, one that makes the most out of existence. The hills were framed with trees, and beyond them stretched a band of sea on which the sky, like a sail becalmed, rested in all its tenderness. I felt a strange joy in my heart, the special joy that stems from a clear conscience. There is a feeling actors have when they know they've played their part well. That is to say, when they have made their own gestures coincide with those of the ideal character they embody, having entered somehow into a prearranged design, bringing it to life with their own heartbeats. That was exactly what I felt. I had played my part well. I had performed my task as a man, and the fact that I had known joy for one entire day seemed to me not an exceptional success, but the intense fulfillment of a condition which, in certain circumstances, makes it our duty to be happy. Here Camus, the theatre man, equates life to playing a part in a play. You must mold your earthly existence into something coherent, like a character in a play, and then play that part the best you can. These are all very existentialist ideas. Nuptials didn't gather much attention when it came out, something that cannot be said about another existentialist work that came out that year. Jean-Paul Sartre, 8 years Camus senior, publishes his debut novel Nausea, and is immediately lionized by the Parisian intellectual elite. Nausea is a book about the meaninglessness and absurdity of life, which makes its hero feel alienated to the world around him. Camus is impressed by the book and reviews it for his newspaper, but he feels that there is something missing. It does not contain that joy of living which he finds in the world, and which he feels that is the very thing that, coupled with the certainty of death, is the reason for the absurdity of life. He starts working on a novella and a play that will portray his own point of view. Meanwhile, real life gets in the way. In September 1939, Germany invades Poland, and Britain and France declare war on Germany. Camus tries to enlist, but is rejected due to his bad lungs. He remains in Algeria, and forms another newspaper called Le Soir Républicain. In the first few months of the war, Britain and France hardly get involved, allowing the Nazis and the Soviets to conquer Poland. Camus' newspaper calls for peace, believing that a world war can still be averted. Although he is very much against fascism and Hitler, he does not hesitate to be critical of his own country, and point out the injustices done towards Germany in the past. When the Soviets invade Poland and declare war on Finland, he attacks the USSR and claims that it is now among the imperialist countries, a position that infuriates his leftist friends. Eventually, after a few months, the French authorities close down the newspaper on the grounds that it is not patriotic enough and thus bad for national morale. In March 1940, Camus moves to Paris, invited to be a writer in a big newspaper. While there, he completes the novella and the play, and also starts working on a philosophical book. But let's talk about the novella, which happens to be one of the greatest masterpieces of 20th century literature, The Stranger. The protagonist is a French Algerian named Meursault, who is telling us about his life. Meursault is someone who lives in the now, affected by the sea and the sun. When it comes to his relations with society, although he is a normative person, he is completely alienated to the things that drive other people. He tells us his story in short, disjointed sentences, each standing on its own and describing something he does. But there is no thread that connects them. He just lives each moment, with no purpose or motive that unites them into a whole. The story opens with the death of his mother, and he goes to attend her funeral. But he has no feelings towards her dead body. Since he lives in the present, once she died, she has no meaning for him. Later in the book, he goes with friends to the beach. They get into a fight with Arabs, and one of them attacks his friend with a knife. The friend wants to draw his gun and shoot him, but Meursault convinces him to retreat and takes the gun away. They take the friend to get medical help, and Meursault is left alone. The sun becomes very hot, and he feels discomfort, so he wants to go back to a place on the beach in which he felt perfection and happiness. He goes there on his own, but on his way he encounters one of the assailants. Meursault is so bothered by the sun that he does not retreat but carries on, and the Arab draws a knife. The sun's reflection from the knife hits Meursault's eyes, overwhelming him and making him feel distress, so he draws the gun and kills the man. He is arrested and put on trial, and he has a pretty good case for self-defense. However, the prosecution brings witnesses that testify to the way he behaved when his mother died, and this works against him. Society cannot understand someone who lives in the present, and sees him as a monster. He is sentenced to death. While in prison, waiting for the results of his appeal, Meursault finally starts to think about his life. Until now he just acted, or at least that's how it seemed from the way he told his story. Now he finally starts to ponder about the meaning of it all. Once again we encounter this theme, that only while facing death do you achieve clarity and authenticity. Meursault comes to the conclusion that his condition isn't worse than anyone else's. We are all sentenced to death, and because of that, all the things that other humans busy themselves with are meaningless. Life is just a succession of unrelated moments, and the only way to put these moments together into a coherent whole, something that will have meaning, is to work for some future purpose. This is what humans do. But since we are all going to die, and anything we work to build will also eventually dissolve, it actually doesn't give meaning to their life. Meursault would rather live with the clarity that there is no purpose or meaning, and embrace the moments of joy that the present gives him as long as he lives. But he knows that this approach will always make him a stranger to other humans. The same theme, but from a different perspective, is explored in the play Caligula, which Camus writes simultaneously. The young Roman Emperor Caligula, after the death of his beloved sister, becomes ridden by the realization that people die and are unhappy. Unlike Meursault, however, he can actually do something about it. He wants to use his power, his unlimited emperor power, to do something meaningful and somehow change the situation. He decides to force all people to live in the truth, believing that in this way humankind will achieve greatness and happiness. He adopts erratic behavior, humiliates all of Rome's noblemen, and executes them at random. Thus, he forces them to forget about their usual daily worries and focus on the idea that they might die at any moment. He hopes that this will force them, especially the artists among them, to develop a new outlook, one that will make humanity happier. But they don't understand what he wants of them, and eventually conspire to assassinate him. Alas, Camus doesn't get a chance to publish the book or stage the play. In June 1940, the German Blitzkrieg completes its conquest of France, and Camus finds himself under Nazi occupation. After a few months of trying to cope, he manages to get to Marseille and take a ship to Oran, back in Algeria. Everything else has to wait. While Camus is busy trying to get out of occupied France, Humphrey Bogart is shooting the film that will bring existentialism to Hollywood. High Sierra was directed by Raoul Walsh, but more significantly, written by a young talent called John Huston, who gave it an existentialist touch. Bogart plays the gangster Roy Earle, a Dillinger-type bandit who became notorious in the early 30s until he was caught and sentenced for life in prison. Unlike Meursault, however, the movie begins with him getting out of jail, after a surprise pardon.
I was getting kind of nervous, Earl. I've been waiting over an hour.
I've been waiting too, over 8 years. The park's down there, ain't it?
Yeah, the park. Say, Earl, you feeling all right?
I will be. Just as soon as I make sure that grass is still green and trees are still growing.
So Earl is very much like Meursault, someone who finds joy in nature. He is a different kind of gangster from what we saw in 30s films. Unlike the 30s gangsters who were driven by their irrational desires, he spent his sentence thinking about his life, and wants out of this existence of rushing towards death. We later learn that his dream is to retire from crime and build a farm in his home state of Indiana. But he must complete one last job before that. The reason he was prematurely released is that a big shot crime boss arranged it, because he wants him to pull a grand jewel heist. Earl intends to use his cut to achieve his dreams of retirement. Earl is as tough as they come, but we gradually learn that his rugged exterior covers positive virtues like integrity, honesty, compassion, and benevolence. While Cagney and Robinson's gangsters won you over with external things like style and charisma, Earl wins you over with his internal virtues. But society cannot see him for what he is. Branded Mad Dog Earl by the media, the public sees him as a monster. And it's not just society. Even when it looks like he might pull it through, fate intervenes and foils his plans. It's as if he is destined to remain an outlaw and never reach his farm and have a happy life. His rebellion is a moral surge, a cry of freedom in the face of an unjust world, and he keeps running to the end. He ends up on the Sierra Mountains, where he fortifies and refuses to surrender himself and go back to jail. He would rather die a free man. While 30s gangster flicks were about failed humans, a cautionary tale about how not to be, Earl represents the human condition. His stint in jail becomes a metaphor for his entire life, in which he feels imprisoned in a bad existence and wants to crash out and achieve a different type of existence. Other characters in the film are the same way, and none of them ever achieve what they dream of. Much like the characters created by Sartre and Camus, it is their existential predicament. The main literary influence behind the movie, however, was an American author. Ernest Hemingway set the tone for American masculinity in the period between the World Wars, presenting heroes who were psychologically broken by the hardships of the time, but found within them the toughness to persevere. Hemingway's style focused mainly on their actions, not on their inner world, and it inspired a generation of American writers. Camus also borrowed from this style for The Stranger, but there the hero has an awakening when he faces death, and then it's all about his inner world. W.R. Burnett, who wrote the novel High Sierra and co-wrote the script, was much inspired by Hemingway. But Huston gave it an existentialist touch, where the hero becomes more aware of the human condition, and Bogart was the perfect actor to bring it to life, creating a new model of cinematic hero. High Sierra came out in January 1941 and was a bona fide hit, putting Bogart on the precipice of stardom. The problem was, this was also the film that ended the gangster flick era in Hollywood. Bogart needed to find another role to play, and again it was John Huston who came to his aid. One of the genres that benefited from Hemingway's influence was the American detective novels. British authors like Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie already turned the detective novel into a highly popular genre, but the American authors brought in Hemingway style, presenting private detectives who were hard-boiled enough to deal with the urban underbelly of America's big cities. For his directorial debut, Huston decided to adapt one of the most popular of these novels, Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. This was actually the third Hollywood adaptation of this novel, but the first two bombed. Huston, however, was a fresh talent with new ideas, and his take was completely different.
What do you want here?
Oh, I'm Sam Spade, Tom Polhouse phone.
Oh, I didn't know you at first. Back there.
Sam Spade is a private detective, the protagonist in several Dashiell Hammett stories. But the main thing about this scene is that here, for the first time, we are witnessing the birth of the Humphrey Bogart character. In some scenes, Spade wears a snazzy zoot suit like 30s gangsters, but when he is out sleuthing, he covers it with a large trench coat and a fedora cocked over to shade part of his face. While we knew what the flashy 30s gangsters were about, he is an unknown quantity, someone we can't figure out. Outwardly, he is very much like the nasty figures Bogey played in the 30s, a cynical loner who displays contempt for the law, doesn't care much for other humans, and even has a sordid affair with his partner's wife. On the other hand, he has integrity and courage, and keeps to the right side of the law. Those around him regard him as totally unpredictable, a fact that he uses to his advantage. The client that hires him in the beginning of the movie turns out to be a manipulative seductress, who wraps many men around her finger. But that doesn't work on Bogart.
You aren't exactly the sort of a person you pretend to be, are you?
I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean.
The schoolgirl manner, you know, blushing, stammering, and all that.
I haven't lived a good life. I've been bad. Worse than you could know.
You know, that's good, because if you actually were as innocent as you pretend to be, we'd never get anywhere.
I won't be innocent.
Good. Oh, by the way, I saw Joel Cairo tonight.
Do you know him?
Only slightly. You're good. You're very good.
What did he say?
About what?
About me?
Nothing.
What did you talk about then?
He offered me $5,000 for the Black Bird. You're not going to go around the room straightening things and poking the fire again, are you?
No, I'm not. What did you say?
I said $5,000 was a lot of money.
It is. It's more than I can ever offer you if I have to bid for your loyalty.
That's good coming from you. What have you ever given me beside money? Have you ever given me any of your confidence?
Nevertheless, he starts an affair with her, which leads him to get involved with a gang of international crooks hunting for a treasure. They are all liars, but Spade proves to be a bigger liar than all of them. He also proves tougher than the 30s type gangster, bringing the image of the working class tough guy to a whole new level.
I didn't expect you till 5:25. I hope I haven't kept you waiting.
Keep on riding me. They're going to be picking iron out of your liver.
The cheaper the crook, the gaudier the patter, huh?
At the same time, he refuses to play ball with the authorities, and is not intimidated by their threats.
I'm a sworn officer of the law 24 hours a day, and neither formality nor informality justifies you withholding evidence of crime from me, except, of course, on constitutional grounds.
Now, both you and the police have as much as accused me of being mixed up in the other night's murders. Well, I've had trouble with both of you before. And as far as I can see, my best chance of clearing myself of the trouble you're trying to make for me is by bringing in the murderers all tied up. And the only chance I've got of catching them and tying them up and bringing them in is by staying as far away as possible from you and the police, because you'd only gum up the works. You getting this all right, son, or am I going too fast for you?
This is the point. Spade represents a breakdown in the trust in the state, in the belief that it can solve our problems. He believes in going it alone, as an individual. He gets involved with the criminals, but in the end, it turns out that his unscrupulous exterior is a facade. He was only playing them, so he could nail them and deliver them to the hands of the law. Deep inside, he was never corrupted.
Don't be too sure I'm as crooked as I'm supposed to be. That sort of reputation might be good business, bringing high-priced jobs and making it easier to deal with the enemy.
This is a new type of cinematic hero. There have been many individualistic heroes in Hollywood films, especially in westerns, but they were always upright and straightforward. The Humphrey Bogart character, at the beginning of each of his movies, is an enigma. In the morally ambiguous reality of the 1940s, he hides his true self deep inside, where it cannot be harmed, until the plot of the film forces him into action that reveals his nature. Then he bursts out with powerful emotions and a primordial sense of justice, crushing the evil before him. He may not uphold the ethics of society, but he still has a personal code of honor. With the trench coat and the hat, and the ever-present cigarette, Bogart defined cool for the 1940s, and would cast a long shadow for many decades to come. As with the movie, the world that John Huston created out of black and white, a shadowy world populated by dubious heroes, psychologically disturbed villains, dangerous femme fatales, and the backdrop of urban depravity, was unlike anything that came in cinema before. Released in October 1941, it becomes a big hit, but it will take 3 more years before similar films will start to appear. When they will become the genre that defined the 40s. Years later, French movie theorists will call it film noir. Film noir usually had no heroes. The protagonists would fall prey to their own psychological depravities and to the seductive charms of the femme fatales. There was only one exception. The Bogart character shows how you can move within this world without being corrupted. He operates in the shadows, between light and dark, between order and chaos, between law and outlaw, and this makes him more powerful than anyone. He isn't like Roy Earle, who is dreaming to break away from this existence and achieve another kind of life. Spade mocks such plans as the stuff that dreams are made of, knowing full well that there is no other existence. He would rather remain true to himself and face the harsh reality by setting his own rules. It is this question, how to face the absurd reality and set rules to live within it, that Albert Camus was trying to answer at the time. Camus spends 1941 in Oran, where he completes a book he began to write in Paris. The book is called The Myth of Sisyphus. The Myth of Sisyphus is a philosophical work, written by someone who wasn't a professional philosopher. As such, it suffers from some incoherency when it comes to the philosophy, but compensates for it in its literary power. Furthermore, it offers a fresh perspective. The main theme of the book is the absurd, a theme that troubled those thinkers who Camus, and others, started to call the existentialists. The basic idea is that human existence is absurd, because it has no meaning. Camus' novelty is in the claim that the meaninglessness of existence is not enough to make it absurd in itself. The absurd results from man's need that existence would have meaning, which clashes with this meaninglessness. It's as if man is thrown into a world that is not compatible with his nature. This clash has 2 aspects. One is man's need to know the absolute truth about his world, the thing that explains existence. The mind's deepest desire, declares Camus, even in its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feelings in the face of his universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity, an appetite for clarity. And he adds, if thought discovered in the shimmering mirrors of phenomena eternal relations capable of summing them up and summing themselves up in a single principle, then would be seen an intellectual joy of which the myth of the blessed would be but a ridiculous imitation. Finding happiness, then, is dependent upon discovering the answer that explains the universe. But since science and philosophy, by that time, have realized that they are incapable of providing this answer, man is devoid of happiness. He feels alienated to the universe he dwells in, a universe that he cannot understand. The other aspect is the clash between man's will to live and the knowledge that he is going to die someday. No code of ethics and no effort are justifiable a priori in the face of the cruel mathematics that commands our condition, writes Camus. The fact that everything that we build is going to crumble, and we ourselves are going to die, seems to render everything we do meaningless. It also seems to render morality meaningless. Why is murder wrong, if we are all going to die anyway? I have to interject at this juncture and say that the only absurd thing I see here is this idea of the absurd, put forth by Camus and other existentialists. The temporary nature of our existence, and our ignorance about how the universe works, are actually the very things that give human life its meaning. For a more detailed rebuttal, check out my debunking of Pascal, in the first video of this series. What Camus identifies as the human condition is nothing more than a historical moment. Christianity created the idea that earthly life is meaningless, and that we should aspire to the truth and eternity we'll find in heaven. Modern thought rebelled against the idea of heaven, but kept defining meaning in the same way that Christianity did. So it kept on looking for eternity and for the absolute truth, and when it couldn't find them, the result was a feeling that life is meaningless. Nietzsche warned us that our thought is still full of Christian fallacies that we need to liberate ourselves from, but Camus, even though he discusses Nietzsche at length, misses this part of his thought. What he calls the absurd is simply a crisis in the Western spirit in the beginning of the 20th century, that reached its peak in the 1940s. But right now we are in the 40s, together with Camus and Bogart, and we need to follow them and work our way out. How does Camus deal with the absurd? First, he points out that humans always had hope that there is another type of existence in which they are happy and not alienated. But modern thought, by putting reason above all, demands of us to reject myth and be faithful to the truth, and we must admit that there is no such existence. We are doomed to this meaningless and absurd life. This realization leads people to suicide, and there are two types of suicide. One literal, in which they decide life isn't worth living, and the other spiritual, in which they give up on reason and return to religion, to the belief in the afterlife. Camus asks if there is another way, if we can show that a meaningless life is still worth living. What is Camus' answer? It begins by remaining true to ourselves. We put reason and truth above all, and reason led us to the absurdity of existence. Therefore, we should embrace this absurdity as our first truth. We should not commit suicide, either literal or spiritual, because that would be a betrayal of reason and a betrayal of truth. We should rather maintain absolute clarity, never giving up on life and never succumbing to the seduction of those who tell us that there is another kind of life. It is a life of constant rebellion, in which human reason remains true to itself in the face of a world that negates it. Camus writes, "The revolt gives life its value. Spread out over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. To a man devoid of blinkers, there is no finer sight than that of the intelligence that grips with the reality that transcends it. The sight of human pride is unequaled. No disparagement is of any use. That discipline that the mind imposes on itself, that will conjured up out of nothing, that face-to-face struggle have something exceptional about them. Through this revolt, then, we can live a heroic life, a life we can be proud of. This pride is enough to make us happy. The next step is to find ways to give meaning to this life, and this is done by filling it with content, living it to the fullest. Camus offers several ways of life that could imbue every moment with meaning. The book ends with a discussion on Sisyphus, the Greek mythology character who was doomed by the gods to eternally push a boulder to the top of the mountain, only to see it tumbling back down and having to start all over again. It seems like a hellish existence, but Camus claims that Sisyphus can find meaning and happiness in the boulder itself, in the work he has to put into his task. The closing line, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy," neatly sums it all up. Again I have to interject, and say how weird I find this whole discussion to be. Of course it is we who should give meaning to our life. Why would we expect of the universe, or of God, or of anyone else, to provide us with this meaning? The question of how we give meaning to our life is one that I discuss in my video, The Meaning and Purpose of Life. But ultimately, everyone has to find their own way to meaning and happiness. What philosophers and artists can do is suggest certain archetypes and models that we can follow. Let's go back to following our heroes. The Myth of Sisyphus is a book divorced from the reality of its time, a reality of war and living under occupation. In Algeria, Camus enjoys relative freedom. The Germans control Paris and northern France, but they allow the French to have a government of their own, a pro-Nazi government that sits in Vichy and rules over southern France and the North African colonies. Under the Vichy rule, French cultural life can at least carry on, and Camus has a chance to publish his books. The Stranger finally sees light in June 1942, followed shortly in October by The Myth of Sisyphus. The political neutrality of these books helps them get published easily, although Camus was forced to make some changes in Sisyphus, most notably drop a chapter about the Jewish author Franz Kafka. Meanwhile, in Paris, Jean-Paul Sartre rises like a meteor and becomes a leading French intellectual, and he writes long and sympathetic reviews of the two books. Camus' name is beginning to become famous, and towards the end of 1942 he makes his way back to Paris. Camus' philosophy, as presented in The Myth of Sisyphus, is completely amoral. One has to live with consciousness of the absurd, and fill their existence with interesting content. It says nothing about the moral nature of this content. Once back in occupied France, however, Camus has to reconnect with his political and moral sentiments. People around him are organizing, joining the resistance movements against the Nazis, known by the umbrella term La Résistance. Camus is drawn to join them, which of course sends him on a soul search, How can he justify taking this action? Can he find an answer to that within his philosophy? America, in the first years of the war, is dealing with a similar question. Should it join the war? In 1941, Hollywood started making some movies that tried to wake Americans to the Nazi menace. In August, Bogart shoots the film All Through the Night, a gangster comedy in the style of Damon Runyon. Bogey plays a Broadway racketeer who isn't always straight with the law, but is a decent man nonetheless. He gets framed in a string of murders, and realizes that it all comes from a Nazi spy ring operating in New York. When he encounters the head of the ring, the latter tries to pull him to their side.
It's a great pity, Mr. Donahue, that you and I should oppose each other. We have so much in common.
Yeah, how's that?
You are men of action. You take what you want, and so do we. You have no respect for democracy. Neither do we. It's clear we should be allies.
It's clear you are screwy. I've been a registered Democrat ever since I could vote. I may not be model citizen number 1, but I pay my taxes, wait for traffic lights, and buy 24 tickets regular to the policeman's ball. Brother, don't get me mixed up in no league that rubs out innocent little bakers and...
Democracy may not be perfect, and our hero may not like its version of law and order, but he has a sense of justice, and he realizes that the Nazis violate it in infinitely more callous ways. When he figures out that they are planning an attack on New York, but the police don't believe him, he tries to organize his underworld buddies to stop them.
Now listen, Marty, I know you're no mental giant, but try to juggle this, all of you. I got a first-hand report tonight on what it's like on the other side from that Hamilton babe. And brother, I'm telling you, we gotta watch our steps. Those babies are strictly no good from way down deep. They're no bunch of petty racketeers trying to muscle in on some small territory. They want to move in wholesale, take over the whole country.
So what? It don't make no difference to me who runs the country as long as they stay out of my way.
That's just it. They're not gonna stay out of your way.
Oh, yes, they will.
Oh, now listen, big shot. They'll tell you what time you get up in the morning and what time you go to bed at night. They'll tell you what you eat, what kind of clothes you can wear, what you drink. They'll even tell you the morning paper you can read.
They can't do that. It's against the law.
Yes, it's unconstitutional.
This scene shows us how many Americans were still ignorant about what fascism is about. But it also shows us why the American spirit was much healthier than the European spirit of the time. While the European spirit became alienated to everyday life, and thus fell for those who offered something else, the Americans were still celebrating the joys of everyday life and their freedom to have these joys. Even American criminals wanted nothing to do with the Nazis, and they follow Bogart's lead in the fight against them. All Through the Night is a delightful romp. Unfortunately, by the time it is released in early 42, the Japanese already made the Americans' minds for them. The slapstick tone of the film falls flat in this new atmosphere. But Bogart is riding high on the huge success of the Maltese Falcon, which turned him into the new symbol of masculinity. The character he established in that film is now called upon to take on the powers of the Axis. For his next feature, he once again teams up with director John Huston and some of his Maltese Falcon co-stars to make the film Across the Pacific. Bogart stars as an American army officer who is dishonorably discharged, and then gets recruited by a Japanese spy ring. But it turns out that it was all a scheme, that he was actually working undercover for his country, and he uncovers a Japanese plot to attack the Panama Canal on the same day that they attacked Pearl Harbor. At a time when the Americans were suffering only losses in the war, the movie does its best to boost morale.
You guys been looking for a war, haven't you?
That's right, Rick. That's why we're starting it.
You may start it, Joe, but we'll finish it.
This patriotism, and the popular cast, ensure the success of the film, but it is rather a heavy-handed piece. John Huston was drafted even before the end of the shooting, and many Hollywood stars joined the army as well, setting an example for the nation. Humphrey was too old for service, so he stayed behind. But as it happened, he ended up contributing to the war effort more than any other Hollywood figure. In his first two war movies, we see the use of the Bogart character. At the beginning of the film, we don't know if he is good or bad, and will he be a patriot or join the Axis. But then his inner decency is revealed. In that, he represents the US of 1941, asking itself if it should fight against a Nazi evil, and then moved into action. But these films did not know exactly how to use Bogart in the most effective way. The third attempt would get it right. Oh, so right.
With the coming of the Second World War, many eyes in imprisoned Europe turned hopefully or desperately toward the freedom of the Americas. Lisbon became the great embarkation point, but not everybody could get to Lisbon directly, and so a tortuous, roundabout refugee trail sprang up. Paris to Marseille, across the Mediterranean to Oran, then by train or auto or foot across the rim of Africa to Casablanca in French Morocco. Here, the fortunate ones, through money or influence or luck, might obtain exit visas and scurry to Lisbon, and from Lisbon to the New World. But the others wait in Casablanca, and wait, and wait, and wait.
This is the exact route that Camille took in late 1940, from Paris to Marseille to Oran in Algeria. At the time this movie was made, he was actually making his way back, but here we continue the journey to Morocco. Again, I will try not to spoil too much, although if you haven't seen Casablanca already, I have to wonder what you are doing with your life. The film is an adaptation of a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's, whose author also made that route back in 1940, but on the way to America stopped in a cafe in Casablanca, where a black American singer enthralled the crowd of refugees with American pop tunes, representing a spirit so different from the sick European spirit they were leaving behind. The play was yet another attempt to prod the Americans to stand up to Nazi evil, but it was never staged. Warner Brothers decided to turn it into a movie, with Bogart playing Rick. Rick's Cafe is a microcosm of America. The first of its people we meet is Sam, the pianist and master of entertainment. And Sam is playing jazz, the musical style that was the soul of the Hollywood period. In the modern age, classical music was the important style. Music would be written down and then performed according to the musical sheets. Thus, it could travel around the world, spread the individual vision of the composer. Often, it was his vision of humanity in its struggle to achieve perfection. By now, however, the modern spirit, and classical music as its purveyor, decayed. The countries that produced the greatest composers, Germany, Italy, and Russia, all became totalitarian. In contrast, the jazz music that came from America was all about living the moment. The musicians would improvise, taking each other to heights of ecstasy and transcendence, trying to achieve a perfect moment. Every performance was different, making every moment unique. And through radio, this moment could be experienced together by people all over the land. The Nazis banned jazz music, but in unoccupied France, it could be played in their faces, refuting their rotten modernist logic. Vichy France is represented by Captain Louis Renault, the head of the police. He follows Vichy's orders and cooperates with the Nazis, but he doesn't seem to like them very much. Stuck in this situation, he develops a cynical attitude towards the world, answering the corruption of the system by being corrupt for his own self-interest. His cynicism is matched only by Rix, who comes over at first as a tough misanthropic individualist, who lives for the moment and cares only about himself. Many people in Casablanca need help, but his answer is always the same.
When they come to get me, Rick, I hope you'll be more of a help.
I'd stick my neck out for nobody.
However, we slowly realize that behind this cynical shell there is a man who cares deeply about other people. He used to be a staunch fighter against fascism, until something happened that made him turn his back on the world. Captain Renault suspects that he is only hiding his true self, so he gives Rick a friendly warning. Victor Laszlo, the head of the anti-Nazi underground, is about to arrive in Casablanca, trying to escape to the west and continue his work. The German Major Strasser was sent to ensure that he doesn't succeed. We can see that Rick admires Laszlo, but he assures Louis that he has no intention to stick his neck out to help him escape. And we believe him, too. There seems to be nothing that can make him break out of his neutrality. But then...
Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine.
The cause of Rick's transformation is revealed, and as the French say, Cherchez la femme. Laszlo is traveling with a woman, the woman who broke Rick's heart and crushed his spirit, and thus begins the love triangle of the ages. Things become even more complicated when the Nazis, with Renault's help, manage to block all exits for Laszlo, and the only one who can help him out is Rick.
You must know it's very important I get out of Casablanca. It's my privilege to be one of the leaders of a great movement. You know what I've been doing. You know what it means to the work, to the lives of thousands and thousands of people. That I'll be free to reach America and continue my work.
I'm not interested in politics. The problems of the world are not in my department. I'm a saloon keeper.
My friends in the underground tell me that you've quite a record. You ran guns to Ethiopia. You fought against the fascists in Spain.
What of it?
Isn't it strange that you always happen to be fighting on the side of the underdog?
Yes, I found that a very expensive hobby, too, but then I never was much of a businessman.
Are you enough of a businessman to appreciate an offer of 100,000 francs?
I appreciate it, but I don't accept it.
I'll raise it to 200,000.
My friend, you could make it 1,000,000 francs at 3. My answer would still be the same.
There must be some reason why you won't let me have them.
There is. I suggest that you ask your wife.
I beg your pardon?
I said, ask your wife.
My wife?
Yes.
Unfortunate demonstration, but more will his presence in Casablanca bring on. I advise that this place be shut up at once.
But everybody's having such a good time.
Yes, much too good a time. The place is to be closed.
But I've no excuse to close it.
Find one.
Sortez, monsieur. Sortez. Everybody's to leave here immediately. This cafe is closed until further notice. Clear the room at once.
How can you close me up? On what ground?
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
More than any other, this segment demonstrates why Casablanca is the greatest Hollywood melodrama of all time. The action moves seamlessly from the dramatic to the epic to the tragic to the comical, and all over again. But it shows us something more. La Marseillaise could be said to be the song that launched the modern age, a rallying cry to rise up against the old world, choose liberty instead, and march on towards a perfect society. Its logic leads to the formation of free societies, but it can also lead to totalitarian societies, when the idea of an ideal state becomes more important than the people it is supposed to be for. The March of Progress led to Europe being under the fascist boot. Rick's Cafe offers the alternative, as in the Hollywood period, America became the vessel of the liberty demanded by La Marseillaise. The cast of the movie is made of a multinational cadre of actors, most of whom escaped Europe for America, including some German actors who opposed the Nazi regime. They present a vision of a free society that judges one by the content of their character, not by their ethnicity. Plus, it doesn't try to shape itself according to some ideal, but allows every individual to seek happiness in their own way. In such a society, they can all coexist, having a good time together, inspiring each other, opening new grounds for each other. Even Rick cannot help being inspired by Victor.
Don't you sometimes wonder if it's worth all this? I mean, what you're fighting for.
We might as well question why we breathe. If we stop breathing, we'll die. If we stop fighting our enemies, the world will die.
What of it? It'll be out of its misery.
You know how you sound, Monsieur Blaine? Like a man who's trying to convince himself of something he doesn't believe in his heart. Each of us has a destiny, for good or for evil.
I get the point.
I wonder if you do. I wonder if you know that you're trying to escape from yourself, and that you'll never succeed.
You seem to know all about my destiny.
The performances in Casablanca are unforgettable. Paul Henry is inspirational as Victor Laszlo, the embodiment of a hero. Ingrid Bergman is more beguiling than ever, breaking our heart again and again. Claude Rains is delightful as Louis, and Conrad Voigt is one of the greatest movie Nazis ever. The rest of the cast is superb as well. But it is the Humphrey Bogart show all the way. Here, the power of the Bogart character is on full display, as only he can maneuver this twilight world of Vichy France and outsmart the Nazis. He just has to work out his inner conflicts first, solve the love triangle. At the end of the movie, finally adorning his trademark look to signal that this is the real Bogart, the man who would stick his neck out for nobody turns around and performs the most famous act of self-sacrifice in cinema history, forever becoming a symbol of World War II heroism in our collective memory. It started right away. When the film was shot, in the middle of 1942, the Allied forces were suffering loss after loss. But on November 8, the Allies land in North Africa, and things start to turn around. Warner Brothers are quick to capitalize on the fortuitous timing. On Thanksgiving Day, a week after the Allies took Casablanca, the movie premieres and creates a huge buzz. By the time it opens in all theaters in January 1943, it is a sensation. The moviegoers feel it represents America, wary about jumping into the fight at first, suffering some blows when it finally joins, but then turning things around. Casablanca is a rallying cry that reminds everyone what they are fighting for.
He's looking at you, kid.
These Bogart films show us why it was obvious to the Americans that the Nazis are the bad guys. The only question they were dealing with is why they should stick their neck out to help the Europeans out of the mess they put themselves in. In France, on the other hand, things weren't obvious at all. Vichy France was a Nazi ally, and a large portion of the population identified with this position. The resistance had to first win the ideological battle if it wanted to win, and for that it needed intellectuals. France needed its own Rick, someone who understood its crisis of spirit and could lead it back into the light. When Camille made his way back to Paris, he did not intend to stay long, but when North Africa fell to the Allied forces, his way back to Algeria was blocked. He remains in occupied France, where he becomes part of Sartre's existentialist circle. While the intellectual elite of France are located mainly in the Sorbonne University, the existentialists sit in coffee houses, among the people, and speak for them. More significantly, Camille starts to get involved in resistance activities. He starts to write for the Resistance newspaper Combat, eventually becoming its chief editor. The activity is effective, and at one point, shortly before liberation, he has to run and hide because the Gestapo are looking for him. His most memorable contribution are 4 essays titled Letters to a German Friend, which he publishes anonymously. The letters are aimed at an imaginary German friend who went through the same crisis of spirit Camille has, but chose a different path and became a Nazi. Camille approaches him in the name of the French people, but he actually speaks for those who believe in a universal free society, against those who believe in forcing their way on the rest of humanity. The first letter, published in July 1943, talks about how the Germans believe that the homeland is above all, and accuse the French of not loving their country enough because their love for it is conditional. Camille answers that we first had to figure out if our country is worthy of being loved. Because we love humanity, we could not bring ourselves to kill for our country, until we figured out when killing is justified. This is why the Germans had the advantage at first, but now we solved the moral conundrum, and this makes us more powerful than them. He writes that the war taught us that, contrary to what we sometimes used to think, the spirit is of no avail against the sword, but that the spirit together with the sword will always win over the sword alone. That is why we have now accepted the sword, after making sure that the spirit was on our side. Camille doesn't specify what the moral solutions are, but he speaks as someone who knows justice is on his country's side, and this is why he can love it again, and this is why he knows it is going to win. The closing states, "This country is worthy of the difficult and beloved love that is mine, and I believe she is decidedly worth fighting for since she is worthy of a higher love. And I say that your nation, on the other hand, has received from its sons the love it deserves, which was blind. A nation is not justified by such love. That will be your undoing. And you who were already conquered in your greatest victories, what will you be in the approaching defeat?" The second letter comes in December 43, and starts to elaborate on what took him out of the moral crisis. Camille speaks in the name of human reason, that thing that was supposed to create a perfect world. Reason has reached a dead end, and got us to a point where human life seemed meaningless. This is why the Germans believe they have a right to commit any crime against it. But Camille says that the war taught us that there is meaning after all. What is truth, you used to ask? To be sure, but at least we know what falsehood is. That is just what you have taught us. What is spirit? We know its contrary, which is murder. What is man? There I stop you, for we know. Man is that force which ultimately cancels all tyrants and gods. He is the force of evidence. Human evidence is what we must preserve, and our certainty at present comes from the fact that its fate and our country's fate are linked together. If nothing had any meaning, you would be right, but there is something that still has meaning. This letter teaches us a lot about the nature of the crisis in the European spirit. The modern age rebelled against religious morality, and believed it could create a secular morality. It tied morality to the progress of man, to the belief that we are all marching together towards becoming one universal humanity, and therefore we should look out for each other. But reason failed to create the perfect world, and this morality thus collapsed. The Nazis claim that this gives them license to do whatever they want in the service of their ideal. But Camille, as always, tells us that we learn something about ourselves when we face death. The Nazis forced us to realize that there is meaning to human life, that it is worth fighting for. He cannot put in words yet what this something is, but he knows that it's there. The third letter is published in April 44. Here, Camille emphasizes that he speaks for all of Europe, the birthplace of enlightenment and democracy, of the spirit progressing through dialogue between equals. The Nazis twisted this idea and bragged that they managed to achieve the ideal of unifying Europe, but the true spirit of Europe is now revolting against them. For you, Europe is an expanse encircled by sea and mountains, dotted with dams, gutted with mines, covered with harvests, where Germany is playing a game in which her own fate alone is at stake. But for us, Europe is the home of the spirit, where for the last 20 centuries the most amazing adventure of the human spirit has been going on. Furthermore, the land of Europe is revolting against the Nazis. Camille is returning here to the ideas of his early writings, where nature mocks human pretensions, mocks those who try to forcefully mold the world in their image. For all those landscapes, those flowers and those plowed fields, the oldest of lands, show you every spring that there are things you cannot choke in blood. The fourth letter is published in July 1944, as the Allies are already approaching Paris. Here, Camille talks about justice. The modern age, believes Camille, began with man's rebellion against the heavens, because they had created an unjust world. However, when it became apparent that man cannot provide an ultimate purpose to his life, the Germans chose to give up and embrace the injustice. Because you were tired of fighting heaven, you relaxed in that exhausting adventure in which you had to mutilate souls and destroy the world. In short, you chose injustice and sided with the gods. Your logic was merely apparent. I, on the contrary, chose justice in order to remain faithful to the world. I continue to believe that this world has no ultimate meaning, but I know that something in it has meaning, and that is man, because he is the only creature to insist on having one. This world has at least the truth of man, and our task is to provide its justifications against fate itself. Here, Camus falls back on his idea of rebellion against the absurd. Man demands meaning, but the world has no meaning, so man must rebel and hold on to his demand. The novelty is that here, the demand for meaning is also accompanied by a demand for justice, which Camus found in the hearts of people faced with the deadly regime that the Nazis imposed. So the Nazis were like his Caligula. They forced people to face death and thus find out what their innermost truth is, and it turns out that this truth is a demand for justice. The role of the philosopher is to develop this demand into a philosophy, and this is the task that Camus would set for himself in the post-war years. These 4 letters, as mentioned, were published in a newspaper. This takes us back to a time when journalists were heroes, fighting for the little man and speaking truth to power. In 1944, Bogart stars in the film Passage to Marseille, in which he plays a French journalist before the war, critical of his country's corruption and of its soft approach towards Hitler. He gets framed for murder and sent to Devil's Island, where he meets other patriots crushed by the unjust and corrupt system. He is on the brink of despair, but when the war breaks, he finds new meaning to life, and he and his friends escape together in order to return to fight for France. By the time they get there, the corrupt win and the Vichy government is installed, so they set for Britain and join the Free France army instead. The film suffers from a convoluted script and isn't very good, but still has the typical Bogart storyline of a moral inner struggle that eventually leads to heroism. Here, it is shared by other characters as well. This is also the story that Camus wanted to tell, a story of many people going together through a moral struggle and emerging as heroes. During the war, he starts to work on a novel, and it eventually grows into the biggest work he ever wrote. It takes until 1947 to finally be done and published. Called The Plague, the story is placed in Oran, the city he lived in the early years of the war. The time is the 1940s, which makes it an allegory for the war. It begins with rats coming out of the sewers and dying in the streets, suggesting that we are talking about a problem that was buried under our feet, but was always there, waiting to come up to the surface. Next, people start dying from a mysterious disease, and the doctors, reluctant to say it at first, eventually realize that the plague is back. People refuse to believe it, since the plague is considered extinct from the country, but they eventually have to come to terms with it. The allegory is obvious. The modern age thought that it has created a more enlightened world, cleaning Western culture of the ways of thinking that led to the barbarities of the past. But the disease is part of human nature, integral to humanity. It always lays under the surface, and at some points it comes up and takes hold over humans, who infect each other. The Nazi disease is not something foreign to Europe, but something that emerged from it. What happens next was very relatable to read in 2021. The city is put under closure, and no one is allowed to leave. You can't even write letters to the outside world, because nothing is allowed out. As the pestilence takes over, the book effectively describes the pain, the horror, the misery, and finally the horrid routine as the daily carnage lasts for months. The residents go through stages of denial and anger, but gradually they come to terms with it and begin to fight back. Faced with death, their true nature is revealed. At first they fill the churches, but as time goes by, they start to appreciate the little pleasures of daily life, the pleasures they always took for granted. Despite the plague, they go out every night to mingle and party, celebrating life. And some bravely put themselves in the line of fire. The main protagonist is Dr. Rieux. He is a man who hates injustice done by humans, and fights against it. But the biggest injustice to him is the injustice found in creation, a creation that allows children to die in diseases. Thus he became a doctor and tries to fight against it. He can do very little against the plague, but he keeps on trying regardless. Then there is Tarou, a man who witnessed an execution in childhood and was so outraged that he vowed to fight to create a society in which such atrocities don't take place. But then he realized that the fight necessitates his side to kill as well, so he remains stuck and doesn't know what the right option is. Should he fight and kill to try and create a just society, or refrain from killing and allow the injustice to continue? When he sees that the plague is too much for the doctors to handle, and the authorities are incompetent, he arranges voluntary groups to do the dangerous and dirty work. Rieux and Tarrou form a friendship out of their mutual fight. There is one moment in which they manage to get away momentarily from the horrible reality they are in, when they go for a swim together. We know that the sea, for Camille, represents a place in which to forget about your individuality, and dissolve for a while in something bigger. In his early writings it was nature. Here, it represents the solidarity with your fellow humans, the thing that drives both our heroes. But it represents something more. In Casablanca, Bogart says that the problems of three people are unimportant compared to contemporary world events. Camille sets him right. Really, it's too damn silly living only in and for the plague, says Tarrou as he offers they go for a swim. Of course, man should fight for the victims, but if he sees he's caring for anything outside that, what's the use of his fighting? The fight, Camille reminds us, is done not to achieve some goal, but to protect people's ability to pursue happiness. As we fight, we should always be mindful of this, and take time to do things that make us happy. Other significant characters are Father Panelou, a Jesuit priest who at first describes the plague as punishment for our sins. Rambert, a Parisian journalist who came to the city to write a piece about the plight of the Arabs, and got stuck in it. He wants to get out and reunite with his girlfriend, and searches for ways to do so. And Gran, a lowly clerk whose life delivered him blow after blow, and yet he carries on, and dreams of writing the perfect novel. Each in his own way represents ways to try to escape man's absurd condition, but in time, they too feel the call of human solidarity, and join Tarrou's voluntary groups. The only main character who doesn't join the fight is Cottard. He is also someone who recognizes the absurdity and injustice of the human condition, but reacts to it by becoming a nihilist. He actually enjoys the plague, because it forces everyone to realize the nature of existence, and become plagued with it as he has. Ironically, this exposes that he too feels the call of human solidarity. But he remains a selfish individualist, and becomes a black market racketeer. He represents the individualist types in Camille's early writings, and here Camille condemns this type of response. Eventually, the plague is defeated, and the city returns to normalcy. But the book ends with the warning that the plague is not gone forever, and one day it will return. Nazism, warns Camille, is entrenched in human nature. It must always be fought. Meanwhile, Bogart keeps on fighting movie Nazis. In action in the North Atlantic, he leads a convoy of ships to bring supplies for the Russians through Murmansk, and in Sahara, he leads a tank through the African desert during the Battle of El Alamein. Two fine war movies, especially Sahara, but they lack the typical Bogart moral dilemma. For the Americans, there are no dilemmas at this point. Everyone is on board the fight against the Nazis. To present a dilemma, Bogey had to be placed in French settings, as he is in Passage to Marseille, and also in his last wartime movie, To Have and Have Not. To Have and Have Not is based on an Ernest Hemingway story, and directed by one of the greatest directors of classic Hollywood, Howard Hawks. Hawks' movies were typified by fast-paced action, and tough, professional, fast-talking men acting as American heroes should. There were several more directors who had that style, but in his films, the women were just as tough, fast-talking, and outgoing as the men. For this film, he teamed Humphrey with his new discovery, a 19-year-old model named Lorraine Bacall. Shot in 1944, as the victorious ending of the war was already in sight, it is a lot lighter in tone than Bogey's previous war movies. And it is one of the most enjoyable, second only to Casablanca. Actually, the story is very similar to Casablanca. It takes place in 1940, in the French colony Martinique. Humphrey plays an American skipper of a fishing boat, who is minding his own business and doesn't want to get involved in the war. The three France people try to hire him to smuggle one of their men, but he refuses, until the callous behavior of the Vichy authorities awakens his sense of justice, and he joins the fight. The jazz music is provided by the legendary Hoagy Carmichael, the clever lines by William Faulkner, and the comical touch by Hawks. Altogether, this would have been enough for a delightful film. But from the moment she comes on screen, it becomes obvious that the real heart of the movie is the Bogart-Bacall chemistry, and that the one thing the Bogart character was missing until now was a beautiful woman at his side, to give him just that little extra bit of panache. Bogey finally found his match. Part of the mystique of the Bogart character is that he is hard to figure out, giving him the edge as he maneuvers between different sides. But that never works on Bacall.
You know, Steve, you're not very hard to figure. Only at times. Sometimes I know exactly what you're going to say. Most of the time. The other times... you're just a stinker.
What'd you do that for?
Been wondering whether I'd like it.
What's the decision?
I don't know yet.
Casablanca turned Bogart into a romantic hero, and now he had the woman to go along with it, and form one of the greatest Hollywood romantic duos. With her sarcastic smile, husky voice, and the famous Bacall look, head slightly tilted down, but eyes looking straight at you, a look that was at once both demure and insolent, Lawrence scorched the screen and made the men go crazy. And the dialogue sizzles.
You know you don't have to act with me, Steve. You don't have to say anything, and you don't have to do anything. Not a thing. Oh, maybe just whistle. You know how to whistle, don't you, Steve? You just put your lips together and blow.
The chemistry between them is a direct result of what was happening off-screen, as the two launched a steamy love affair. Humphrey was married at the time, and was 25 years Lawrence senior. Everyone frowned on this liaison, but it quickly became apparent that the two were deeply in love. Shortly after, they were married, Bogart's fourth marriage after 3 previous unhappy attempts. This time, he finally found the love of his life. The film was very warmly received, and the two lovebirds were quickly teamed up again with Howard Hawks to create Bogart's first post-war movie, The Big Sleep. By now, film noir was an established genre, and it was time for Bogart to come back and remind everyone who the king of noir is. The Big Sleep was a perfect vehicle to do so. With Bacall as his counterpart, Bogart reaches a level of cool that has rarely been matched in the history of pop culture. Once again, Bogey plays a private eye taken from the literature of the time, and this time it is the most famous of them all, Philip Marlowe. The adaptation turns Raymond Chandler's dark detective novel into more of a romantic comedy, but still maintains enough perverse darkness to make it noir. The war made Hollywood more interested in the dark side of humanity, more willing to accept that Freud was right and humans are driven by subconscious irrational drives. The heroes of film noir are slaves to these drives, driven into actions that destroy them and others. But Bogart, the cynical but honorable individualist, the tough guy who bows to no one and no thing, rises above all this. Only an existentialist can thrive in such an ambiguous world, and Bogart's Marlowe is the embodiment of an existentialist hero, bringing the Bogart character to perfection. He is incorruptible, as he plays all sides against each other. With Howard Hawks' snappy pacing, he is a joy to watch.
Is that so?
Do you mind?
No, I'm used to it.
I think we'll let the police in on this. We'll have some law.
Yeah, why not?
Who are you, soldier?
Marlowe's my name. I'm a private detective.
Who's the girl?
A client of mine. Geiger tried to throw a loop on us, so we came up here to talk things over.
Convenient, the door being open when you didn't have a key, huh?
Yeah, wasn't it? By the way, how'd you happen to have one?
That any of your business?
I could make it my business.
I could make your business mine.
Oh, you wouldn't like it. The pay's too small.
After the war, the US stood as the leader of the free world, militarily and economically, but also culturally. Until then, while everyone acknowledged its power, the Europeans still had a snobbish attitude towards Americans, and saw them as vulgar and unsophisticated.
You give him credit for too much cleverness. My impression was that he's just another blundering American.
We mustn't underestimate American blundering. I was with them when they blundered into Berlin in 1918.
But, as many European artists fled to it during the war, America now became the new cultural center. The American elite accepted this leading role, but still had an inferiority complex towards Europe. It was largely still thinking in modern terms, and beholden to European culture. And the hottest thing in Europe, in those dark years after the full scope of the horrors of the war was revealed, was existentialism. The existentialist now became a hero, standing up alone against the rotten world. Sartre visited the States right after the war and became a sensation, and did not forget to promote Camus' work. It could have been the beginning of a beautiful friendship between France and the US, but Sartre, like most other French intellectuals, still had a superiority complex when it came to the Americans, still thought that he had American culture all figured out. The French, and this is true to this day, never realized that pop culture offers a much better alternative to the decaying modern culture, and never tried to understand pop on its own terms. Camus was somewhat different. As the Americans became interested in learning more about Albert Camus, he was invited to America, and landed there in March 46. He stays there for a few months, leaving just as The Big Sleep premieres. Unlike other Frenchmen, he is fascinated by America, realizing that there is something more to it. The Americans are also fascinated by this handsome and inspiring figure. In a talk, Camus points out that the European outlook of life is tragic and pessimistic, while the American outlook is optimistic, and that we should aspire to synthesize the two. But he doesn't realize that the reason for it is that pop culture has a different metaphysics and spirituality from modern culture, offering a fresh alternative. He does, however, react positively to the products of this culture, like cinema and jazz. Meanwhile, he also continues to be the chief editor of Combat. He wants to establish a new kind of journalism, one that isn't partisan but gives the reader the truth, and stands up for the little man and for the oppressed. After the war, those who collaborated with the Nazis are put on trial, many of them sentenced to death. The left, driven by the communists, is hunting them down with zeal, blaming everyone without compassion for the tough situation they were in under the occupation. Camus agrees that the collaborators should be severely punished, but stands up for their rights and takes a more empathetic tone, annoying his friends on the left, including Sartre. On the other hand, as the Algerians start to demand sovereignty and the end of colonial rule, he tries to get the French to see their side, a very unpopular position at the time. But his most controversial position is the one he takes on communism. In the first general elections after the war, the Communist Party wins more than a quarter of the seats. The Communists are popular for opposing the Nazis during the war, and are employing it to get their way. The left feels that World War II would not be won if it doesn't also lead to the constitution of a communist utopia. Sartre, and most French intellectuals, adopt Marxist historicism, believing that the working class revolution is inevitable. They attack American imperialism and capitalism, forgetting who saved them from the Nazis, while taking an apologetic tone about the imperialism of the Soviet Union, and about its horrific crimes against its own people. Camus, a leftist, is also critical of American capitalism and imperialism. But, almost alone among French intellectuals, he takes a much stronger stance against the Soviet Union and against Marxism. He believes that one should stand against murder and injustice, no matter who commits them, and refuses to ignore them when they are done in the name of a future utopia. As testimonies of people start to come out about the true nature of the Soviet Union, Camus reads and promotes them, while the rest of the left turns a blind eye. He does hold socialist views, but believes they should be promoted through free dialogue. Thus, he argues that we should promote democracy all over the globe. Still a modernist, he dreams of a democratic world government that will be the end product of modern progress. Bogart has his own battles. Hollywood studios generally kept their stars away from controversy and forbade them to express their views. Bogart could not be contained. His on-screen character reflected his personality, which hated phonies and liars and stood with those who were suffering public witch hunts. Nowadays we don't like it when Hollywood stars express themselves politically, but we have to remember that those were different times. Bogart was well off by now, but he wasn't a millionaire elitist. The people knew that he, and the other Hollywood stars, was one of them, and had to struggle hard to get to where he was. Thus, they were seen as representatives of the common man. Bogart would often express his liberal views, and they carried weight. In 1947, this was put to the test. The Congress starts to investigate Hollywood for un-American activities. In other words, for spreading communist propaganda. 19 Hollywood figures are summoned to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, suspected of being communists. Most of Hollywood is incensed by this attempt to censor it, and a group of famous actors and directors organized to go to Washington and defend their colleagues, making a stand for freedom of speech. Humphrey Bogart quickly emerges as the leader and spokesperson of the group, which has a lot of sympathy in the media. But as the 19 testify, the case crumbles. Contrary to what they publicly claimed, most of them were in fact communists, and instead of speaking for freedom of speech and the American way, they take the opportunity to bash the Congress and bash America. Public opinion turns sharply against them, and anyone who defends them, Bogey being the most prominent, starts to be suspected of being a commie sympathizer. Bogart feels duped and washes his hand of the whole thing, but the damage is done. The Congress gets its way, and Hollywood is forced to capitulate. Those who were communists at any time in their life are given the choice to either name names of other communists in the business or lose their job. Humphrey starts to feel the pressure to publicly denounce his former position. He doesn't want to do so, fearing to add his voice to a witch hunt that will burn a lot of innocent people. But the atmosphere leaves no place for nuance, and eventually he capitulates and publishes an article titled "I'm No Communist," in which he stresses his hatred for communism and clarifies that he was merely making a stand for freedom of speech. His fears would come true, though. Hollywood executives take it upon themselves to purify the business of communists, and they create a blacklist of people who are not allowed to work in it anymore. A lot of talented people lose their jobs, including many who aren't communists. Soon, this witch hunt spreads throughout the country, to every other business. In both the US and France, then, witch hunts were taking place. The Nazis may have been defeated, but the world was not out of the modernist darkness just yet. To the end of the decade, Bogart would keep playing in film noirs, but the teams that produced them did not know how to make the most out of the genre and of his talents. The exception are the films in which he finally reconnects with John Huston. In 1948 come two Huston-directed films that add to the Bogart lore. In Key Largo, he plays Frank McCloud, a war hero paying a visit to the family of a fallen comrade that owns a hotel in Key Largo. But the hotel is taken over by a mob, headed by notorious gangster Johnny Rocco. The family expects McCloud to fight back, but he is past his hero days.
In the war, weren't you?
Yes?
Get any medals?
Couple?
Brave, huh?
Not very.
Why'd you stick your neck out?
No good reason.
What are you saying, Frank?
I believed some words.
Words? What words?
Well, they went like this. But we are not making all this sacrifice of human effort and human lives to return to the kind of a world we had after the last World War. We're fighting to cleanse the world of ancient evils, ancient ills.
What's that all about? I remember those words.
Well, that makes two of us.
We rid ourselves of your kind once and for all. You ain't coming back. Who's gonna stop me, old man?
The words belong to President Roosevelt, who vowed that defeating the Nazis will be just the start of our efforts to create the perfect world. Roosevelt, then, was thinking within the modern mind frame. McCloud believed in this vision, But when he came home from the war and realized that Johnny Rocco and his kind still thrive, he became disillusioned and apathetic.
Now, what you were saying, that's the truth. Only you don't believe it. I can see right through you. What you really think is I'm better than Rocco. He's filth, like the old man said. Right? Right. He's got a gun, you think, and I haven't. You figure it's the gun. Well, listen, soldier. Thousands of guys got guns, but there's only one Johnny Rocco.
How do you account for it?
Well, he knows what he wants, don't you, Rocco?
Sure. What's that?
Tell him, Rocco.
Well, I want,
He wants more, don't you, Rocco?
Yeah, that's it. More. That's right, I want more. Will you ever get enough?
Will you, Rocco?
Well, I never have. No, I guess I won't. Do you know what you want?
Yes, and I had hopes once, but I gave them up.
Hopes for what?
A world in which there's no place for Johnny Rocco.
Mm-hmm.
This is the problem, the Americans told themselves after the war. We have a good system, but there are greedy people who exploit it and sour it for everyone else. If enough good people stand up to them, we can fix it. Rocco puts it to the test, to see who wants it more, the greedy people or the good people. He wants to show his captives that the good people, even after they defeated the Nazis, don't have what it takes to defeat him.
All right, you got a gun now. You gonna use it or not? Kill him, Major. Yeah, kill him, Major. Go ahead, show him how you're not afraid to die. Shoot! Looks like you don't want it enough, what you want. That's the last one. Something's funny for a change.
One Rocco, more or less, isn't worth dying for.
But since this is Bogart we are dealing with, the hero goes through a transformation when he encounters evil, and finds his courage again. We get an enthralling battle of wills between Edward G. Robinson, the 30s gangster, and Humphrey Bogart, the 40s existentialist hero. In the 30s, Bogart always played second fiddle to Robinson. Here, the two Hollywood legends are on equal ground, in a battle for the soul of America. America, now the leader of the free world, started to regard itself as the leader in the march towards achieving the modern dream of a perfect society. Key Largo has a basically leftist message, showing the common people getting together to fight against the greedy ones and fulfill FDR's promise. However, this mindset of getting rid of the rotten apples was also the very thing that allowed the witch hunt of the communists, another group of undesirables. America was suddenly in danger of becoming like Europe, getting swept away by modernist delusions of utopia. But there was something in it that kept it from descending into totalitarian thinking, and Bogart's other Huston-directed film of that year shows what it was. The Treasure of the Sierra Madre was not as popular as Key Largo upon release, but over the years, it came to be considered one of the greatest movies of all time. Bogart plays Fred C. Dobbs, a penniless panhandler desperately trying to get by. But he is a decent man, and we come to like him. He then joins a couple of prospectors to go digging for gold in Mexico. The three amigos strike big, and it looks like their future is settled. But then, Dobbs goes through a transformation. He becomes greedy and paranoid, wanting all the gold for himself and suspecting the other two of plotting against him. Bogart gives the performance of his life, as he does his usual thing but in reverse. This time, he starts out good, but when his true nature is revealed, it turns out to be rotten. So while Key Largo told us that the problem is the greedy people, and if we get rid of them utopia might prevail, the Treasure of the Sierra Madre answers that we cannot get rid of them, because greed is part of human nature. There is a strong Christian sensibility to this film, portraying man's fallen nature and mocking his attempts to transcend it. In The Plague, Camus chastises Christianity for willing to accept evil and not fight it. The background for this portrayal was the church's lackluster reaction to Nazi crimes. But there is also a good side to the Christian belief that evil cannot be fully defeated. It prevents you from becoming totalitarian in the first place. The communists believe that man's nature is good, and the problem is the system that needs to be changed. And so the Eastern Bloc was now busy trying to engineer a perfect society, and finding out that it only leads to oppression. In America, on the other hand, left and right found a balance. A national consensus emerged, reaching its height in the 50s under President Eisenhower. The country was dedicated to progress, as the left wanted, but also remained faithful to Christian values as the right wanted, and upheld its democratic system. In Europe, this strong Christian counterforce was no longer there. Could atheist thought create checks and balances to prevent itself from becoming totalitarian? This is the question Camus was trying to answer. In mid-1947, he leaves Combat, after the paper loses most of its readership. His hope was to create a new kind of journalism, one that tells the truth and isn't partisan. But post-war journalism fell back into its old ways, and it turned out that this is what most of the readers wanted. He receives some consolation from the success of The Plague, which is finally published to rave reviews and becomes a bestseller. He writes a couple of plays that deal with the question of evolution, and starts working on a philosophical book that would present his new outlook. The Rebel, published in 1951, crystallizes Camus' political worldview. It is also one of the books that shaped my worldview as I was growing up. Once I learned more, I realized that this unscholarly work contains a lot of inaccuracies, but I still largely agree with its conclusions. Camus starts by going back to the myth of Sisyphus, and says that the most immediate question back then was the question of suicide, while now we are dealing with the question of murder. He returns to the absurd, the first certainty that he found about human existence, and asks if we can find within it the answer to why murder is illegitimate. However, when he describes the absurd, we feel a shift. In the myth, he described the absurd as the result of the clash between man's need for meaning and the meaningless world he lives in. Here, he describes it as a clash between man's demand for justice and the unjust world he lives in. This clash causes man to rebel, but then he realizes that fighting the injustice demands of him to kill, to cause harm and suffering to other humans. The question, then, is what are the parameters in which killing is justified? Can we find any, without relying on metaphysical moral laws? Again, Camus makes the point that without external moral laws, the thing we should rely on is the truth that we find within us when faced with death. We find that there is something in us that rises up against unjust suffering and killing, done to ourselves but also to others. This suggests that we feel solidarity with our fellow humans, so this must be our first truth. This argument, it should be said, is rather dubious. It doesn't have to be solidarity with all humans, it can also be the result of tribal solidarity. However, I'm with Camus on this. When it comes to human suffering, our empathy to other humans transcends tribalism. So, while the myth of Sisyphus was about man standing alone and rebelling against the absurdity of his existence, in The Rebel he finds that he wants to rebel against other people's condition as well. Like Bogart in Casablanca, he is willing to forego his comfortable life because he cannot remain indifferent to the plight of others. As Camus puts it, I rebel, therefore we exist. Camus then starts to discuss what he calls the metaphysical rebellion. Those are the thinkers and artists throughout the ages who cried against the injustice found in creation. And this chapter, more than any other work, shows us where the problem really lies. It lies in the fact that all those thinkers regarded existence as creation. That is, as something that was created by someone. Because of that, they expected it to be just, and were outraged when they realized that it isn't. Even the atheist thinkers he mentions, despite not believing in a creator, still thought along these lines, and even Camus himself is unable to transcend it. For me, as someone who is a product of the pop age and thus free of this old religious notion, existence is just existence, and I don't expect it to be just. So I just oppose injustice where I see it, without blaming the entire world for it. But for those modern thinkers, the unjust nature of existence was a travesty, which we must fight in order to eradicate. Thus, they were driven to extreme positions. Camus, at least, realizes that the solutions given until now were too extreme. He moves from the metaphysical to the historical, follows the history of the rebellion against injustice in the modern age, and observes that it always ended in either nihilism or totalitarianism. It is this part of the book that was the most controversial, as in it Camus slaughters many cows that were sacred to the French and to the left. In France, the figures of the French Revolution were seen as heroes, who might have done some wrong things, but ultimately led to the Free Republic. Camus mercilessly shows how they abandoned morality, and ended up serving the injustice they initially rose up against. He proceeds to Hegel and Marx, and shows how they established the idea of inevitable historical progress towards utopia, the very idea that gave revolutionaries license to kill, because the utopian end justifies the means. They basically turned history into God, which humans then blindly served. He focuses mainly on the period that I call the modernist period, especially in Russia, and shows how it was a time when revolutionaries still cared about morality, and all the soul-searching they went through to find when killing is justified. But they failed to find a sufficient answer. And because of that, the rebellion went in two directions in the late modernist period. Some fell into nihilism, which eventually led to killing for an ideal that is detached from justice. Camus characterizes fascism and Nazism as coming from this strand. Others despaired of the hope to bring about a just world in moral ways, and opted for a revolution that will force it on the people. This is what led to the totalitarian communist regimes. Camus is one of the few French intellectuals to portray communist totalitarianism as bad as fascist totalitarianism, and he does something even more outrageous. He analyzes that this murderous totalitarianism is not the result of the Bolsheviks going astray from their ideals, but that it is baked into the ideals of Marxism and communism. It is this position that ends his friendship with Sartre. Sartre is very critical of Bolshevik crimes, but he still believes that the world is marching toward a workers' revolution, and that the communists have it basically right. His review of the book tears Camus to pieces, as an upstart who doesn't understand philosophy and therefore has it all wrong. The two former friends become enemies. What are Camus' solutions, then, as offered in the book? First of all, we must remain true to the initial rebellion. By rebelling, man is affirming his value, his right to life, to freedom, and to justice. But when he turns from rebellion to revolution, he ends up betraying these values. We must therefore reject any revolution that is based on ideal visions of the world, and instead live as constant rebels, people who rebel against the concrete injustices we find around us. The revolution of the 20th century, writes Camus, claims to base itself on economics, but is primarily political and ideological. It cannot, by its very function, avoid terror and violence done to the real. Despite its pretensions, it begins in the absolute and attempts to mold reality. Rebellion, inversely, relies on reality to assist it in its perpetual struggle for truth. The former tries to realize itself from top to bottom, the latter from bottom to top. Far from being a form of romanticism, rebellion, on the contrary, takes the part of true realism. If it wants a revolution, it wants it on behalf of life, not in defiance of it. That is why it relies primarily on the most concrete realities, on occupation, on the village, where the living heart of things and of men is to be found. Politics, to satisfy the demands of rebellion, must submit to the eternal verities. Finally, when it causes history to advance and alleviates the sufferings of mankind, it does so without terror, if not without violence, and in the most dissimilar political conditions. We see that Camus still believes in historical progress towards a better world. What he rejects are those who think they know how to achieve utopia, and thus take license to act immorally. Instead, any rebellion must promote free speech and dialogue, through which we can progress. The rebellion must also support the freedom of art, as it is art through which new ideas can develop. Literature, he writes, is the greatest form of art, as in the novel, the writer combines life experience with philosophical musings, and fills existence with content. He calls this thought Mediterranean thought, and negates it with German thought. Mediterranean thought is rooted in Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian traditions, but more importantly, it comes from a place where the sun is dominant, where its feeling on your skin reminds you of your concrete existence as a human who enjoys life on Earth. This feeling is what the German thought is missing, so it adopts ideologies that forget about concrete humans and their happiness. Camus, we see, remains true to his earliest insights. It's also very similar to the logic of the myth of Sisyphus. Once again, the awakening is the realization of the absurdity of existence, and it leads to a way of life of constant rebellion against this absurdity. The difference is that there the rebellion was against meaninglessness, and here it is against injustice. In that, Camus pretty much gives us the philosophy behind the Bogart character. Speaking of Bogart, 1951 was an important year for him as well. Once again, he teams up with John Huston to make a classic movie, but here we witness the change in the zeitgeist. In the beginning of the 40s, Huston and Bogart created a new model of masculinity, but those years provided a new model of femininity as well. 40s female stars were the role models for the wartime attitude, when women found themselves needing to run their lives without men. They were sophisticated and tough, they usually had jobs, and they knew how to use their sexuality to get along in a man's world. We already met such stars, like Ingrid Bergman and Lorraine Bacall, but the quintessential 40s star was Katharine Hepburn, the icon of women independence. In The African Queen, the biggest male 40s star finally gets together with the biggest female 40s star. But it's not what you'd expect. In the 50s, America moved towards putting society above all, steering away from individualism. The Bogart and Hepburn characters had to adjust. We mentioned that the American right believed in original sin, in man's inability to transcend his bad nature. In the emerging national consensus, the left now adopted psychoanalysis to reach the same conclusion. Men were now portrayed as wild beasts, driven by strong urges they could hardly control, while women were portrayed as driven by the desire to create families. And since the family was regarded as the main unit in the formation of a perfect society, it was the woman that had to take charge. Women were now encouraged to go back home and focus on family. The housewife was portrayed as a job like any other job, perhaps even the most important job of all, and women were instructed how to do it well, while the men were to go out and bring home the bread. Everything was aimed at rearing the children up in the right way, so they grow up straight and create a wholesome society. In 50s Hollywood films, the all-heroic image of the individualist man was portrayed as a thing of the past, and the message was that he should conform and become part of society. The woman was portrayed as the responsible one, the one who should be in charge, the one who must tame the man and educate the children. Independent or sexually outgoing women were portrayed in a negative light. The African Queen is, in many ways, the transitional movie between the decades. It is still Bogart and Hepburn, but they are beginning to change. The film is set in Africa in 1915, and Hepburn and her husband are missionaries deep in the Congo. Their only connection to the outside world is a boat that comes occasionally up the river, run by a cynical and cranky Bogart. But then World War I knocks at their door, and the husband is killed by the Germans. Bogart takes her with him back to civilization, and it becomes an amusing romantic comedy in which the prim and proper Christian, basically an Eleanor Roosevelt impression, clashes with the vulgar and hedonistic sailor, going through all kinds of adventures until they fall in love. In the process, as usual, Bogey goes through a transformation. At first, he doesn't want to get involved in the war, but in the end, he does. This time, however, he doesn't do it on his own, but has to be convinced by the woman. And she does it not through her sexuality, but through her righteousness. We are sensing the 50s coming, but this is also the last hurrah of the heroic Humphrey Bogart character, and Hollywood knew how to honor it, by giving Bogart his first and only Oscar. The African Queen is an enjoyable and fitting swan song. In the 50s, all the traditional Hollywood models of heroic individualism, like the cowboy, the gangster, and the private detective, were deconstructed to support the new emerging consensus. Bogart's most memorable work of the decade came in such movies. In The Caine Mutiny of 1954, he plays a US naval captain during the war, a good soldier that the stress of war turned into a paranoid basket case. Bogey's performance set the standard for how paranoids would be played in movies from then on. In Beat the Devil of 53, he is a member of a gang of hopelessly inept international conmen. This offbeat comedy, written by Truman Capote, got bad reviews, but in time became a cult favorite, seen as one of those so bad it's good movies. Some say this is the moment camp entered Hollywood cinema. The 50s, then, were all about conforming and becoming part of the system. Bogart, always a rebel, found it hard to exist in such an atmosphere. One escape was to go out to sea on his boat. Like Camus, it was the sea where he could lose himself. Another was to stick it to the system by refusing to fall in line. Towards the middle of the decade, Humphrey and Lauren became famous for heading the Rat Pack, a group of showbiz luminaries like Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland, who were known for their excessive partying and drinking, and flouting of traditions and norms. While everyone was expected to work towards a better future, the Rat Pack broke away to have fun in the moment. The Hollywood period was drawing to an end, and whenever this happens to a period, it becomes self-aware. In the 50s, Hollywood started to make movies mocking itself and criticizing its own dark sides. Several things contributed to the demise of old Hollywood. First, there was the blacklist, that made it lose a lot of good people. Second was the rise of television. And third was the breaking of the big studio system by the courts, that decided it was monopolistic. The studios would no longer own the stars, like they used to. Sensing the change, in 1948 Bogart forms his own independent production company, called Santana. Ever the individualist, he is trying to go it alone, but the results are mixed. The best Santana movie came in 1950. In A Lonely Place is a classic film noir, taking place in Hollywood. Humphrey plays a screenwriter who hasn't had a hit in years, and is quite cynical about life. The police suspect him of murder, but we see that he is actually a noble person. So far it sounds like the regular Bogart scenario, but gradually we realize that he has a violent streak, and we, along with his lover, begin to suspect he might be the murderer after all. If you want, you can choose to see this as an allegory for Hollywood, realizing it is not as good as it thought. The film was directed by an exciting new talent called Nicholas Ray, and this is the movie that brought him fame. 2 years earlier, Ray already directed a film for Santana, called Knock on Any Door. Here, Bogart plays a lawyer defending a young hoodlum suspected of murder.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard the district attorney list Nick Romano's past vices, his excesses, his crimes, none of which have any bearing on the charges here today. They're not pertinent. They are pertinent, however, in another sense. They pertain to who is Nick Romano, why is Nick Romano, what is Nick Romano.
I'll do you one better. When is Nick Romano? What he means by this is that Romano was a good kid who was constantly let down by society, and was therefore driven to crime. It's a leftist message, and in 30s cinema it would have served as an indictment of American society. But post-war Hollywood was different, and the psychology of the individual also played a part. The criminal here is not depicted as some innocent victim, but as an active agent who delves enthusiastically into a life of crime, driven by a motive.
From here on in, I travel in a hurry. What I used to say still goes. Live fast, die young, and have a good-looking corpse.
This motto has been in literature since the 1920s, but this is the first time it is uttered on the big screen. In 1955, Nicholas Ray would go on to direct a film that heralded the birth of a new period, a period that was entirely under the shadow of this credo. Rebel Without a Cause deals with one of the biggest problems America was grappling with in the 1950s, the problem of juvenile delinquency. The entire nation was geared to produce the perfect society, and the youth was supposed to be the product of this effort, the representative of that society. And yet, many kids still chose to rebel. The title shows how America believed there is no true cause to rebel against, so youth rebellion must be the result of psychological issues. And this movie, and others tried to suggest what these issues were. But post-war youth had a different mindset altogether. It no longer believed in modern ideals, which were alien to it. It created its own culture, which developed an entirely new logic. The mid-50s were thus the beginning of a new period, in which pop logic would completely overtake modern logic. I call it the rock and roll period. In the rock and roll period, the leading medium was pop music, starting from the rock and roll rebellion of the mid-50s. Throughout this period, that lasted until the mid-2000s, there existed a youth culture with its own values. And these values lived up to what Albert Camus preached. The rebellion should be done not for the sake of overthrowing the system, but for the sake of rebellion itself, because in that rebellion you assert your existence. While modern logic used prison as a metaphor for current society, a society we want to break out of, rock and roll was about staying in this prison and partying inside, because there is no greater fun than rebelling and partying in the face of oppression. And, like Camus said, you should give aesthetic form to this rebellion. In the rock and roll period, every few years there would be a new generation that would rebel against what came before, and dress its rebellion in new musical form, which would then be the basis for a new group identity. The other dominant medium of the period was television, and it too affected many changes. In 1952, Bogart stars in the film Deadline USA as a newspaper chief editor who learns that his paper is about to close.
Miss Garrison, you've got to stop them. Your husband created a new kind of journalism, and you helped him. Take a look at the first paper you ever printed. Here, page 1, quote. This paper will fight for progress and reform. We'll never be satisfied merely with printing the news. We'll never be afraid to attack wrong, whether by predatory wealth or predatory poverty. You're not selling the day, you're killing it.
This was how journalism saw itself in the modern age, as a catalyst for progress. In the 30s and 40s, as everything became political, this approach had its heyday, and journalists like Albert Camus became culture heroes. But by the 50s, people went back to focusing on their everyday life. Camus quit journalism, expressing his disillusionment with it, in words very similar to what Bogart says here.
Wild and yellow, but it's not exactly a newspaper.
It keeps its people working.
Well, maybe if I'd given you this kind of paper, you'd still have jobs. There's a place for this kind of sheet.
Where, Daddy?
All right, so it's not your kind of paper. Who are we putting out papers for? You? You? Not enough anymore to give them just news. They want comics, contests, puzzles. They want to know how to bake a cake, win friends, and influence the future. Ergo, horoscopes, tips on the horses, interpretation of dreams so they can win on the numbers lotteries. And if they accidentally stumble on the first page, news.
This is the modern mindset speaking. The pop mindset understands that those other things are no less important than the news, as the fight against injustice should be done within the confines of enjoying life. Camus did make it a point that you should take time to enjoy life, but he still regarded the fight as more important. In the rock and roll period, the pop mindset took over, and we understand that one should have fun while fighting. Camus, in The Rebel, acknowledges that sometimes it is necessary to do ideological killing in the fight against oppression, which negates the value that murder is wrong. His solution is to say that if you must kill, you must then also be prepared to be executed for your crime, to uphold the principle that murderers cannot be part of humanity. A very noble position, but not one people can be expected to live up to. Thankfully, television solved this problem, as it rendered ideological killing completely unnecessary. We realized that if you could do something that would get on TV, it can travel around the world and be a lot more effective than any terrorist act. Non-violent rebellion now became the credo, and this type of rebellion can also be fun. And when you focus on fun, you can also blend in news and information. As television now became the center of fun, it could also be the source of news that changed the world. In 1954, Ed Murrow aired his famous expose of Senator McCarthy, which helped in ending the communist witch hunt in America. Newspapers tried to compete, but they were a declining medium. Camus simply failed to realize this change. For Camus, the 50s were a decade of constant rebellion. The rebel made him hated by a big part of the French left-wing intelligentsia, and he was now on his own, not belonging to any camp. He continues to trailblaze his own way, taking a stance on every political issue, always trying to stand up for justice while appreciating the nuances of the situation. The main battle in those years is Algeria, his homeland, which in 1954 explodes in violence. The French establishment still regards Algeria as an inseparable part of France, and the government takes a hard-handed approach against the Arab insurrection. The French left supports the Algerian demand for independence, and portrays French Algerians as rich oppressors and colonizers. Some, like Sartre, even defend Arab terrorism. Camille supports Algerian independence and tries to get the French people to see the Arab perspective, but he denounces the terrorism and opposes the Arab demand to banish the French. He points out that most French Algerians, like his own family, are poor people and belong to the land no less than the Arab natives. He tries to work for a solution that will allow them to stay in an independent Algeria, and believes that their presence would only help the country prosper. Alas, he is a voice in the wilderness. The country descends into brutal civil war, which lasts years and ends with all the French expelled. Algeria only lost from it. To this day, it failed to become a free and prosperous country. Meanwhile, as a result of all his brave and principled positions, Camille becomes a culture hero, a revered fighter for justice, the embodiment of the existentialist hero. And he adopts a look suitable for this stature, based, of course, on the look of a movie star. Can you guess? Yes, indeed, Camille starts to be favorably compared to Bogart, a comparison he occasionally makes himself. He is particularly enamored with the role he played in The Big Sleep. For many, Camille is the intellectual Bogart. In 1956, Camille publishes what started out as a short story, but grew and grew until it became a novella. And what a brilliant novella it is. The Fall is a first-person monologue by a man who calls himself Jean-Baptiste Clemence, who lives in Amsterdam and is talking to a stranger at a bar. He tells us that he used to be a very respected lawyer, a righteous fighter for the poor and the weak, a man who was adored and lauded by society and was very pleased with himself. But one winter night he passed a bridge and saw a young woman standing there and looking at the water, and after he got some distance away, he heard a splash behind him and realized that she jumped into the river. He thought about jumping in to save her, but he was too snug and didn't want to get into the freezing water, so he told himself it is too late anyway. He kept on living, but the incident started to dig deeply into his subconscious. Gradually, he realized that all the good things he ever did were done only when there was a crowd to see it, and at other times he wasn't so virtuous. He was basically what today we call a virtue signaler. He therefore quit his practice, and now he is sitting in a bar and telling his story to others, trying to wake them up to the evil and hypocrisy of humanity. However, the more he talks, the more we realize that he is still no more than a virtue signaler. He hasn't really changed. This is just a new way to make him feel good about himself. There's a lot of the old Camille here. Once again, he emphasizes the feeling of solidarity with other people, which is part of us even if we try to ignore it. Once again it is symbolized by the sea, a place where we lose our individuality and become part of humanity. The hero failed to jump into this water, failed to answer the call of solidarity, so now he lives in Amsterdam, close to the water, and calls himself after John the Baptist, hoping he will get another chance to redeem himself. But the hero's hypocrisy is something new. There is definitely an autobiographical dimension here, Camille admitting to himself that he did not always live up to his standards, especially in his relationships with women. But it is also a scathing criticism of the hypocrisy of the left, of those many leftists who engage more in virtue signaling than in actually trying to help people. Many French intellectuals who did nothing during the Nazi occupation were now the loudest voices in preaching to everyone what they should do to stand up to fascism. In 1956, the French left finally breaks away from the spell of the USSR, following its invasion of Hungary. But a big part of it still believes in Marxism and communism. While America is already in the process of overcoming McCarthyism and adjusting to the mindset of the rock and roll period, the French intelligentsia is still stuck in outdated modernist ideas. From here, France will start its decline into cultural irrelevancy. The Fall is published in May 1956. A few weeks earlier, Bogart's latest film is released, called The Harder They Fall. It's a good movie, and it, too, is about hypocrisy. Bogey plays a sports writer named Eddie, an honest man who lost his job and can no longer provide for his family. So he agrees to become a press agent for a new heavyweight boxer, managed by a racketeer named Benko who fixes all the fights in his favor. Eddie sells out his values and becomes part of the con, but his conscience and his wife keep badgering him about it. Bogart does a good job at displaying Eddie's self-revulsion, even as he plays along. Eventually, he does the right thing and breaks away from Benko. In the last 5 minutes, it's the good old Bogart, who stands up for what is right, and decides to go back to journalism and expose Benko and his type. Which is fortunate, because this was the last film Bogart ever did, and it's endearing that he went out on this note. Early in 1956 he is diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus, and undergoes painful treatment. The cigarettes, the prop associated with him most of all, done him in the end. He retires to his home, from which he keeps on fighting bravely and honorably, maintaining his tough and acerbic front in the face of death, but to no avail. He died on January 14th, 1957, aged 57. Ironically, even though Camus was the one with tuberculosis, it was Bogart's lungs that failed him in the end. For Albert Camus, 1957 actually represents a high note, even though he too is suffering, physically from the tuberculosis that went worse, mentally from the situation in Algeria. But he is also named the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, the second youngest to ever win the esteemed prize. The choice is also odd because Camus had a relatively thin body of work, and was much less prolific than other writers. But the Nobel reflected the fact that he was more than a writer. In the 50s, he came to be regarded as the conscience of the world, an honest thinker who looks into the spiritual maladies of his time and tries to work his way out, a fearless writer who would use his pen to fight against injustice, no matter who serves it. In the modern age, the greatest hero was the author, the one who presents an individual vision that takes humanity one step forward. Very few lived up to this ideal as much as Albert Camus. But the modern age was drawing to a close, and Camus felt it. He claimed that literature lost its power, and in the mid-50s he goes back to theater. Just like Bogart escaped the suffocating universalism of the 50s by being part of a dissident group of like-minded individuals, the Rat Pack, so does Camus find refuge in a small troupe. In the theater, Camus makes daring adaptations of classic novels, updating them to the time. In the 50s, there was still power left in those novels, and there was still power left in theater, but not for long. Camus belonged in the modern age, just like Bogart belonged in the Hollywood period, and just like Bogey knew when to depart and not stick around in a world where he no longer belonged, so did Camus. He was not going to last long anyway with his bad lungs, but an accident sealed his fate earlier. On January 4th, 1960, Albert Camus died in a car accident. He was 46 years old. Around the time of his death, French philosophers started talking of la mort de l'auteur, the death of the author. The author, the leading figure in the March of Progress, lost his aura. Camus was arguably the last to belong to that pedestal where we place the likes of Poe, Balzac, Tolstoy, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Joyce, and Hemingway. This realization of the death of the author is one of the things that led to the realization that the modern age itself has come to a close. But the French failed to realize that there was a new logic, the pop logic, which emerged out of mediums different from literature, and offered an alternative. So they remained committed to literature, and with the death of the author, they shifted the focus to the reader. The reader was now described as the creative force, the one who gives meaning to the text by interpreting it. This developed into the idea that you have the power to interpret things any way you want, which became one of the tenets of postmodernism. Instead of offering an alternative, as the Americans did, French postmodernism remained essentially bound to modern thought, but stripped it of its content. At the same time, young French film critics revived the idea of the auteur, but applied it to film directors. In the Hollywood period, the director was seen as merely an employee, someone who was there to arrange the movie in a way that will make the stars shine. The French critics pointed out that directors like John Huston, Howard Hawks, and Nicholas Ray had a style of their own, a style that constitutes a personal vision. This, they believed, should be the model. The director should be the artist, the creator of the film. Shortly, they became film directors themselves and applied their insights. 2 months after Camille's death, Jean-Luc Godard released his debut movie, A Bout de Soufflé, an existentialist crime drama about a petty criminal on the run. The criminal, played by Jean-Paul Belmondo, models his look, his attitude, and his mannerisms after his hero.
Buggy.
The film was the beginning of a new movement, the French New Wave. As classic Hollywood declined and lost its glamour, French cinema filled the void with sophistication. For a moment, the French stars were considered the most glamorous. But they took their cues from classic Hollywood, especially from Bogart. Meanwhile, the auteurs of the New Wave were heavily inspired by existentialism and film noir, and the influence of Camille and Bogart can be felt in the films that they created. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camille names the actor as one of the models of how to fill your life with content. Since life is all there is, the actor makes the most out of it by experiencing many different great lives. Hence, he writes, the actor has chosen multiple fame, the fame that is hallowed and tested. From the fact that everything is to die someday, he draws the best conclusion. An actor succeeds or does not succeed. A writer has some hope even if he is not appreciated. He assumes that his works will bear witness to what he was. At best, the actor will leave us a photograph, and nothing of what he was himself. His gestures and his silences, his gasping or his panting with love, will come down to us. So the actor, believed Camille, gives up on immortality, realizing it is not important, and chooses a profession in which he lives the present to the fullest. Of course, Camille was thinking of theater actors when he wrote this. As a modernist, he did not think of cinema as an art form. Had he done so, he would have realized that movie actors do leave something behind. The invention of recording devices enables us to capture their gestures and silences, their gasping and panting. The invention of recording devices is the thing that enabled the rise of the mediums of the pop age, and the logic that comes with them. Bogart's acting captured his present and filled it with great content, but we can still experience it, long after his death. This is what I meant by saying that the existentialist insights are already taken as self-evident by the pop age. Camille started as a theater actor, and understood the power of acting, how it connects you to the moment. But he still thought like a modern man, and used his writing to achieve fame and staying power. At the same time, Bogart was already achieving them through acting, and he taught millions around the world how to act out their lives and be connected to the moment. And Camille's other philosophical and political insights have also been played out by Bogart, and through his influence, became part of the pop age. Which is also why Camille, unlike many other writers of his generation, could be relevant even for the pop-minded. In the early 60s, as the rock and roll kids took over pop culture, they were inspired by Camille to rebel, and learned from Bogart how to be cool while doing so. In the late 60s, alas, rebellion turned to revolution. The French youth forgot Camille's warnings, and turned to radical left-wing politics. It led nowhere, and only served to show that France was now hopelessly behind the times. In America, meanwhile, the hippies were trying to carry out a revolution of the mind, aided by psychedelic drugs. "Don't Bogart that joint" became a counterculture catchphrase, drawing from the myth that Bogart could smoke an entire cigarette in one pull. It meant that you should share your joint with others, not hog it for yourself. But this revolutionary phase was short-lived, and American pop culture kept on preferring rebellion to revolution. French cinema flowered in the early 60s, but was still tied too much to modernist values, and quickly withered. Meanwhile, a new generation of American directors emerged in the late 60s out of the counterculture, and gave Hollywood new life. They adopted the idea of the auteur, making films that expressed their own vision, but they drew their material from pop culture. One of these movies was Play It Again, Sam, from 1972, based on a 1969 play by Woody Allen. Allen plays a recent divorcee who tries to find love, but is hopelessly bad at romance. Bogart, whom he is obsessed with, is an imaginary mentor who tries to help him along, until he finally finds his inner Bogart, and realizes that it is more satisfying to be decent and honorable than to get the girl. This was the first of many plays and films in which Bogart will be the role model for the heroes. Classic Hollywood was over, and actors were now measured more by their acting abilities than their star quality. Most stars of the Hollywood period were seeded from memory, but there were those whose memory remained, and only grew bigger over the years, as they became legends and pop culture icons. Of those, no one grew bigger than Bogart, the biggest Hollywood legend of them all. The most important figures in the cinema of the rock and roll period were the directors, the auteurs. They turned it into a powerful art form, but there was a price to pay. The movies of the Hollywood period were very quickly produced, and were a collaborative effort. Casablanca, for instance, was written as it was being made, and no one knew how it was going to end. The performances of Bogart, Bergman, and the rest determined for the writers what should be their fate. This enabled Hollywood to be connected to the moment. Auteur films take at least a couple of years from the moment of conception to the actual release, so they fall behind the times. Cinema lost some of its power, but Hollywood managed to remain relevant by keeping in tune with what was going on in the pop world, while also drawing from its glorious past, the past that keeps on inspiring our culture to this day. But the main medium now was pop music. Now that rock and roll was the voice of youth rebellion, jazz suddenly became respectable. For the adult audience, Frank Sinatra was now the coolest, and he took over the Rat Pack and turned it into an entertainment combo. In 1969, songwriter Paul Anka acquired the rights to adapt a French song called Comme d'habitude into English, and wrote it with Sinatra in mind to sing it. Appropriating the Rat Pack attitude and lingo, he wrote a song called My Way, an existentialist boast by someone who always went his own way and never bowed to anyone else's idea on how he should live his life. But the song contains none of the tragic feeling that always accompanied existentialism. This is self-satisfied individualism, marking the burgeoning of existentialism. In the rock and roll period, the American elite adopted the individualism of the Hollywood period, the individualism that enjoys living in the modern world. By the 80s, this will lead to an explosion of hypercapitalism, presided over by someone who was an actual Hollywood actor in the Hollywood period, Ronald Reagan. Someone who didn't join the party was a young British singer-songwriter named David Bowie. Bowie also wanted to adapt Comme d'habitude to English, and when he realized Paul Anka beat him to it, he retaliated by writing and recording a song called Life on Mars, based on the chord sequence of My Way. This record, released in 1971, shows that the young generation of the early 70s cannot connect with the sentiment of My Way. It is about a young girl who goes to the cinema on her own, trying to find in it models of existence, like Hollywood used to provide. But every movie is just cliché, offering things that she had seen and lived before. She wonders if there is a different kind of life, perhaps on Mars, but everything just brings her back to her dreary existence. Bowie realized that only rock and roll can provide the answer. If Hollywood no longer produces stars who offer models of existence, rock and roll has to step in. In 1972, he transforms himself into Ziggy Stardust, a rock star whose main attribute is that he is a star, an alien who comes from Mars to offer another way. To create the Ziggy persona, he draws a lot from the glamour of Hollywood stars, and establishes a new musical genre, glam rock. Glam rock drew a lot of its imagery from classic Hollywood, and was full of references and songs that eulogized the movie stars of old. In 1972, the glam band Roxy Music released 2HB, a record about Bogarts.
Here's looking at you, kid, hard to forget. Here's looking at you, kid, at least not yet. You're
went deeper than any other glam artist, any other rock artist, for that matter. In his record Rock and Roll Suicide, he paraphrases a poem by Andalusian poet Manuel Machado, who wrote, "Life is a cigarette, cinder rush and fire. Some smoke it in a hurry, others savor it." The rock and roll generation preferred to burn fast in an ecstatic and exciting life, rather than savor it and be stuck for decades in a boring bourgeois existence. Bowie looked for another way. Time takes a cigarette, puts it in your mouth. You pull on your finger, then another finger, then your cigarette, he sings in the opening. The singer made a couple of failed attempts to find something that would lead him to the ultimate high, but then he found his cigarette. However, now that he had smoked it in full, he is burned out. He has committed rock and roll suicide, lived out his life fast, so he can no longer reach those heights again. Or can he? The end of the record suggests that you can find a new thing, which will take you to the highest high yet again. Life is not a cigarette, but a packet of cigarettes. You can live fast without dying young. This track closes the album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, the 1972 album that finally brought the logic of the pop age to full fruition. It constitutes a realization that every good thing goes through a process of rise and fall, and the right way to live life is to be part of it when it rises, but then ditch it when it starts to fall, and transform yourself by joining something else that is on the rise. While the Hollywood period was about living in the present, Bowie decreed a new ideal for the pop age: live in the extended present. In a way, it follows what Camus suggested: push a rock to the top of the mountain, enjoy the challenge and triumph of the climb, and when the rock tumbles down, start all over again. But Camus got it wrong about one thing: it is not the same mountain. The process of climbing fills you with content, which transforms you and makes you grow. Bowie was more inspired by another existentialist philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche believed that you do conquer the top of the mountain, but after a while the rush is gone, so you look for another mountaintop to conquer. And since you are now higher than you were, in other words, you have achieved growth, you can aim for even higher peaks. Another difference between early Bowie and Camus is that while Camus believed that the sense of solidarity is part of human nature, Bowie was more cynical about it. Solidarity, or rather love, as he calls it in his 60s inspired tongue, is something that happens when people come together around a shared goal, and it dies when the goal is no longer inspiring. Bowie did not believe love can last. The idea that love is short-lived is one of the main problems he grappled with, and features in many of his records. Faithful to his insights, Bowie kept on regenerating with every album, but by 1976 he felt that he plateaued. Rock music seemed to have exhausted its possibilities. There were no more mountains to conquer, no more sunbirds to soar with, and he was just moving from station to station in a meaningless circle. It was a feeling shared by a new generation, almost all of whom were inspired by Bowie and wanted to walk in his footsteps. This was the punk generation, which fell back into nihilism, into a feeling that life is meaningless. Suddenly, Camus' more nihilistic writings became relevant again. The Cure's 1978 single Killing an Arab is inspired by The Stranger, and The Fall, the seminal post-punk band, took its name from Camus' titular book. We were now deeply into the pop age, and the crisis was different from what the modernist 30s generation experienced. But finding and redefining the meaning of life is something that every period has to go through, and the rock and roll period reached that point. In 1977, Bowie moves to West Berlin, the city surrounded by a wall and by the communist enemy. There, right on the mouth of the volcano of conflict waiting to erupt and destroy the world, he deals with the problem. His album Heroes tries to find the principle which will ensure that our transformations will be meaningful, and we can keep on living an exciting and heroic life. The title track provides the answer. It describes two lovers meeting at the foot of the Berlin Wall, and the boy is telling the girl how it is. They live in a world that will always have wars, always have hate, and nothing they can do will change this fact. All they can do is defy this hate by loving each other, but love is only temporary, and will eventually die. They can be heroes who defy hate, but just for one day, before they lose the fight. All seems lost, but here, in the pits of despair, the boy realizes that this is actually the answer. If love allows you to be heroic in the face of hate, and if hate will never die, it means that we can always be heroic by keeping on believing in love. Love might be temporary, just for one day, but there is always someone or something new to love, which means that we can be heroic again, and keep on being heroes, forever and ever. And so, he finds the principle that gives meaning to life. Bowie, then, eventually comes to a conclusion very similar to Camille's. Early on, he described solidarity as something that arises from creating a shared identity around something. Now he puts solidarity as the first principle. We should maintain our solidarity with our fellow humans, so whenever someone builds walls between us, we can defy these walls by creating a shared identity, and thus experience a heroic and exciting existence. In the modern age, the heroes were seen as those who are bringing us closer to the utopian future. In the pop age, they are defined as those who fight to allow people to live a good daily life. After punk, rock music became dedicated to fighting for human rights all over the globe, while realizing that it is a never-ending fight. Bowie was still not completely content, though. At some point, he decided to make a transition into adulthood, into a life where he doesn't completely transform himself every year, but maintains a more stable kernel while going through his changes. With this transformation, however, he started to be dissatisfied with fleeting love. In his 1986 record Absolute Beginners, he once again sings about lovers at the dawn of their love. The video clip shows him as Humphrey Bogart, but it is a Bogart who realizes that he is out of cigarettes, out of the symbol of his cool. As we know, cigarettes are symbolic for Bowie as well, used as a metaphor for an exciting existence. So this is quite a problem. The cigarette brand is Zebra, and it manifests in a zebra woman which he chases throughout the video, trying to find love and excitement once again. When he finally catches her, they share a kiss, but then she disappears, just another love that didn't last. As we see this, however, the song tells a different story. For the first time, Bowie expresses belief that love can actually last, that it can be everlasting, just like in films. This is Bowie using Bogart to play a private detective looking for an answer, until he realizes he was looking in the wrong place. His problem was not part of the human condition, but simply a sign of immaturity. Now that he is more mature and stable, he has become capable of long-lasting love. A few short years later, he found the love of his life. The hitch was that this was the last of the philosophical problems that he had to solve, and his art suffered as a result. In 1997, he releases the single Day In, Day Out, in which he sings about the hardships of people living in the 80s, but puts very little of himself into the song. The video shows a couple of recording angels documenting these hardships, and signals his new direction. He is going to be an artist who observes and documents the reality around him, not within him. This direction, alas, was pretty boring. It would take a few good years before Bowie would find a way to become interesting again. A few months later, another artist used the idea of recording angels to much better effect. The German director Wim Wenders was known for making movies about the emptiness and meaninglessness of life, but with Wings of Desire, his new feature, he suddenly reversed course. The film follows a couple of Berlin-based angels who listen to people's thoughts and record the spiritual side of humanity, until one of them becomes jealous of humans and wants to experience the physical, earthly side as well. Suddenly we realize that it is the immortal angels who live meaningless lives, whereas human life is full of beauty, meaning and wonder. Albert Camus is mentioned as one of the things that enrich life and make it worth living. One of the actors in the film is Peter Falk, famous for playing the TV detective Columbo. Columbo usually wears a Bogart-style trench coat, although he is always crumpled and unkempt, an unassuming figure that is designed to make criminals underestimate him. Here, Falk plays himself, coming to Berlin to shoot a new movie, a detective story that takes place right after the war. As he picks up the outfit, he tries to stay away from the Bogart look, but not very successfully. As we follow him around, we realize that he is the character who is aware of the fact that human existence is better than angel existence, the one who is there to tell the angels about the splendor of life. Wenders, then, is using the existential Bogart image to open our eyes to how great human life really is. In 1995, David Bowie releases his own detective story. In the album Outside, he assumes the role of a detective trying to solve a murder that was done as an art project. If he can decipher the meaning of the art piece, he would be able to figure out who the murderer is. Bowie, then, is still in a capacity of observer, but he finally found a way to make it interesting. It is also an admission that he, the legendary trendsetter, no longer understands the art and the spirit of the time, that it has become a mystery to him. Once again, Bowie captured the change as it was happening, because this was the beginning of the cyber period, in which his values, forged in the rock and roll period, were no longer relevant. Just as Camus and Bogart led the way in the Hollywood period, showed how to live a meaningful and ethical life, Bowie did so for the rock and roll period. But now the paradigm has shifted, we are in a new period, and once again we find ourselves unsure. So far, no one has emerged to show us the way. In a new paradigm, the old answers no longer work. However, that doesn't mean that they are worthless. We went through this long tour through history, because learning history can help us in more than one way. First, it helps us understand how we got to where we are, and this knowledge is valuable in our search for new values. Secondly, some of the insights that our predecessors came up with still apply today, if we can find a way to update them to our time. So now, to bring our journey to a close, let's see what lessons I think we can still learn from our heroes. The lessons I am about to impart apply mainly to atheists and left-wingers, although I'm sure theists and right-wingers can find them valuable as well. The first lesson is that you should live in the present. Don't waste your time believing that the meaning of life is to be found in some perfect future or afterlife, but live for the moment. To best achieve that, you must also have a future that you aim at, some peak that you are trying to conquer. But this future peak is there in order to make your present life exciting. The question if you conquer it or not is secondary. What matters is that the struggle to conquer it gives you joy. This implies that you choose constant rebellion and reject revolution. Revolution is performed by those who believe that there is a perfect reality that we should aspire to. Rebellion just rejects the current reality, perhaps even tries to create something better, but does not believe that there is a perfect state. Life is a never-ending rebellion. It is not an easy life, but that's a good thing. If your life is easy, you are not really living it. It is the Sisyphean struggle against hardships that makes you feel full of life, that makes every moment worth living. Politically, the rebellion is done out of empathy with other humans, out of your natural sense of justice that is riled up by seeing people suffer. But you must resist the temptation to adopt an ideology that aims to end injustice and suffering once and for all. No one has that solution, and it only leads to totalitarian and murderous ideologies, and to much greater injustice and suffering. We cannot create a perfect world, but we can choose the options that would cause the least suffering and injustice, and would ensure that people have freedom to pursue happiness. At every moment, this should be the guiding light. When you fight, you must be aware that you are going to get dirty, and cause some suffering. But you should still do it, if refraining from fighting would cause even greater suffering. Finally, you should not forget that the fight is done for the sake of people's ability to enjoy life, because daily human life is enjoyable. Those who want revolution claim that life is essentially suffering, and believe that they have the cure for it. But that's just their own failure to realize how joyful life can be. The fight should be done for the sake of people having the freedom to enjoy life in any way they want. As you fight, don't forget to take time to enjoy your own life, because that is the basis for everything. Those are the lessons that I learned from Camus and Bogart, who forged them at a time when the free world faced its biggest threats. We are in a different time now, with new challenges. But, no matter what period we're in, no matter what mediums we are using, no matter what problems and challenges we are facing, those fundamental things apply. as time goes by.